party on claim of right for Scotland. I inform the House that I have not selected the amendment, and in order to move the motion, I call the leader of that party ready in his place on the front bench, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I'm sure the whole House would like to join me in congratulating the former member for Clackmannan and East Stirling and former presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, George Reid, who is celebrating his golden wedding anniversary today with his wife, Daphne. Mr. Speaker, the principle of unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle and has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. Mr. Speaker, these words are not mine. These are the words of the Lord President in 1953 during the case of McCormick versus the Lord Advocate. This Parliament, Mr. Speaker, I accept, has a great deal of power, and rightly all of us who are Democrats should respect the will of the people. But if we are to accept and respect that will in this place, then why not in Scotland? Mr. Speaker, why is it that the Tory government thinks it can do whatever it wants to Scotland and get away with it? Many in Scotland are outraged that the Conservative government has argued that times are not normal and that allows them to change the devolution settlement in the teeth of the opposition of the Scottish Parliament. Put simply, the Conservatives have no mandate for the power grab on the Scottish Parliament. You can see the case is this. In Scotland, it is the Scottish people who are sovereign.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He's spoken about a power grab. If there is a power grab, why did his leader in Scotland, the First Minister, have to increase her cabinet from 16 to 26 because of all the extra powers coming to Holyrood, according to Nicola Sturgeon?
That's right. My goodness. We are talking about the sovereignty of the Scottish people, and that's what we get. I'm not even going to dignify that with any... You know, this is early in the debate. Can I suggest that people will be watching this, and it might be an idea,
Order. There is a tendency for there to be what I would call a gesticulation fest whenever there is a debate between members of the Scottish National Party and government backbenchers. And the right honourable gentleman must be heard, and I say very gently to Mr Thompson, who is normally a model of the urbane representative of his people, that it is indeed an early stage, and he must remember above all the merits of calm. Mr Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And you know, I must say that the reason that we have called this debate in our opposition time today is the real anger that people in Scotland feel about what has taken place. That the Parliament that Scotland voted for in the referendum in 1997 is being attacked. That our rights are being attacked by a Conservative government, backed by their so-called Scottish Tory friends, that went through the lobbies to take away powers from the Scottish Parliament. And we're having this debate tonight, and let's look around us. I can see my colleagues from the SNP, and to be fair, I can see colleagues from the Liberal Democrats and the Labour MPs from Scotland that are here as well. Where is the rest of the House? Where are the Conservative MPs that voted the measures through? They can't even be bothered to turn up to defend what the Conservatives have done to Scotland. That's the reality. I'm not going to give way. Sit down. Is it very fitting today, Mr Speaker, that the Scottish National Party use our opposition day on the 4th of July, Independence Day, to defend the interests and the rights and the will of the Scottish people? Listen, it might not be Independence Day to you, but I'll tell you this. The way that the Conservative Party are treating Scotland, our Independence Day is coming, and it's coming soon. The claim of right acknowledges the...
very grateful to him. The honourable gentleman says that Scotland's independence is coming, and my honourable friend from Orkney and Shetland and myself put an amendment up to his motion today, which unfortunately wasn't selected, but we understand why. But I wonder if he would agree with that Smythe amendment to his motion on the basis that the Scottish people did have a vote in 2014 and they agreed to stay in the United Kingdom.
Well, as a matter of fact, the honourable gentleman is correct. Of course the people in Scotland voted in a referendum in 2014, and I can say to the honourable gentleman and to others that put their name to that amendment that yes, we would have accepted that amendment if it had been taken this afternoon. But you know, the fundamental issue is this. Many people have said that on the 18th of September 2014, when the polls opened in Scotland, between the hours of 7 in the morning and 10 at night, that the people of Scotland had sovereignty in their hands. The difference between those of us on these benches and the Conservatives is that we believe that the Scottish people are always sovereign. And in the light of the change in the facts and the circumstances, and those circumstances being that when Scotland voted to stay in the European Union by a decisive majority, that the wishes and the rights of the Scottish people are being ignored by a Conservative government that wants to drive us out of Europe. In these circumstances, it's perfectly right that the people of Scotland have the opportunity to demonstrate their sovereign will.
The honourable member talks about referenda. I'm getting a bit confused, and it doesn't take a lot, I admit that. But are we talking about the referendum on the 23rd of June when the British people voted to leave the European Union? And if they had decided to remain in the European Union, would those powers still be in Brussels to this day?
They want them to go back.
If you were watching this in subtitles, it might be not for viewers in Scotland, because the fact of the matter is the people of Scotland voted to stay within the European Union, and that's the point. Because if you put that in the context of the debate that took place in Scotland's referendum in 2014, we were told two things. We were told that if we stayed within the United Kingdom, that we were to lead the United Kingdom. But we were also told that if we voted to stay in the United Kingdom, then our part in Europe would also be preserved. And what has happened? Any pretence of Scotland leading the UK has been thrown away by the Secretary of State for Scotland. He doesn't believe that we're a partner in the UK. He believes that we're a part of the UK. How can you have a Secretary of State for Scotland that's supposed to represent Scotland's interests when he's prepared to lie down and be walked all over because he doesn't see Scotland as being an equal part in the United Kingdom? And he can shout and scream in this chamber, but the reality is he's failed to defend Scotland's interests. Yes, you can point, you can gesticulate, but the people of Scotland...
But I am not pointing or gesticulating. Now, does the right honourable gentleman, I know he's breathing fire at the moment with considerable eloquence and at some pace, does he wish to take an intervention from the Secretary of State, yes or no?
I won't in this case. I'm very grateful for... But he will have his opportunity later on. I want to make progress because I know that many members wish to speak. Mr Speaker, the claim of right acknowledges the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs and the obligation on elected representatives in all their actions and deliberations. The interests of the people of Scotland shall be paramount. The claim of right is not simply a historical document, but it is a fundamental principle that underpins the democracy and constitutional framework of Scotland. The 1989 claim functioned as a declaration of intent on the sovereignty of the Scottish people. It sets the Constitutional Convention which 10 years later saw the people vote in a referendum for the re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament, a Parliament that this UK government now seeks to undermine and ignore. Before those on... I will give way one more time.
The honourable gentleman has made reference to the Scottish Constitutional Convention and the claim of right in 1989. With the benefit of hindsight, does he think perhaps it was now a mistake for the SNP not to sign the claim of right or take part in the Constitutional Convention?
I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and I'm going to come on and deal with that part. But I will do this. I will acknowledge the work of the Constitutional Convention, but let's not forget that the reason that the SNP was in the position that it was is because others in the Constitutional Convention would not allow the principle of independence to be discussed at that time. But I'm grateful of the enormous progress that we have made on the back of the Constitutional Convention. Before those on opposition benches start to jeer and snigger, yes, it is a fact that the Scottish National Party were not present for the signing and did not take part in the convention, but the SNP did take part in early discussions, but withdrew when it became clear that the convention would not countenance independence. We believe and continue to believe that ruling out such an option was to deny a key principle of the claim to choose the best form of government. But we've always supported the sentiments of the claim of right. The SNP has committed and recommitted to its principle. We acknowledge the sovereign rights of the Scottish people determine the form of government best suited to their needs. I really do hope that people in Scotland are watching this. We have a Conservative member from south of the border failed to be elected in Scotland that says all heart. This has nothing to do with heart. This is about the rights of the people of Scotland that voted for devolution, that they're finding that this UK Parliament is taking away their rights in the teeth of the opposition of the Scottish Parliament and every single party in the Scottish Parliament, with the exception of the Scottish Tories. When will the Scottish Tories start to listen to the people of Scotland? Because this is not about the SNP. This is about the Scottish Parliament. This is about the people of Scotland. And let's not forget that the Conservatives have lost every single election in Scotland since 1955. You've been defeated. Yeah, you can see, look at the 13 that have been elected. There are 35 of us here from the Scottish National Party that won the election for Scotland. That's the reality. The Conservatives are in a minority administration in the Parliament. You would love to have the majority of MPs that we have from Scotland, and I can tell you this, it's not likely to happen. We have defended the sentiment time and time again, and we're here to do it again today. Why today, some in this chamber might ask? Well, the facts of this matter are, over the past few weeks, we've seen the biggest power grab conducted by this government since devolution. We have seen sit-down. We have seen the Tory government disrespect the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government and the Scottish people. The interests and the democratic choices of the people of Scotland have been shoved aside by the UK Government. Devolution has been downgraded and the authority of our Parliament has been diminished. While the Tory Government in London seeks to destroy our constitutional settlement and undermine the sovereignty of the Scottish people, we in the SNP will not let the Scottish people be ignored. We will do all that we... Turn up the volume. Turn up the volume. Turn up the volume. I would simply say, just carry on. Carry on. Because what you've just done is insulted the people of Scotland, as you continue to do. We will do all that we can to ensure that the wishes of the Scottish people are respected. Today, we ask as well, I hear watching, but the question to the Conservatives, will you respect the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, yes or no, because you've failed dismally to do it up till now?
We have respected that.
I'm not sure that the honourable lady has been listening to me, because I made that point. Of course we respect the referendum result in 2014, but the simple fact of the matter is that the circumstances have changed. We're being dragged out of Europe against our will. And I expect that the honourable lady wants us to stay in the single market and the customs union as well. I would simply say to the honourable lady, she talks about having a second referendum in Euro. What she should do is get behind the Scottish National Party, because let me remind this House, in 2016, the SNP went to the people of Scotland and we sought a mandate to have a referendum on Scottish independence if circumstances in Scotland changed. Guess what? We have a majority for independence in the Scottish Parliament. If you want to protect Scotland's interests in Europe, if you want to stay in the single market and the customs union, it may well be the case that independence for Scotland is the only way to do that. I'm going to make progress. Today we ask this House to consider the claim of right and to recommit itself to the spirit of devolution, to place the people of Scotland at the heart of decisions, not cast them aside. Only a few weeks ago, we witnessed the shameful Tory power grab. This House and this Government showed nothing but utter contempt for the devolved administrations as the EU Withdrawal Bill was pushed through without consideration of the views of the devolved institutions. The Scottish Parliament had voted overwhelmingly, by 93 votes to 30, to refuse legislative consent for Clause 15 of the EU Withdrawal Bill, and as such, it should not have been passed through the House of Commons with the clause intact. But the Tories decided acceptable. They trotted through the lobbies, voting against the will of the Scottish people. That's what you did. Mr. Speaker, we all know that the Sewell Convention established the long-held practice that the UK Government cannot legislate in devolved areas without the consent of the devolved Parliament. Well, we at least thought we did. Well, there we are, there we are, there we are. This is the sovereign Parliament. You might want to say that to your voters in Scotland, that you don't believe that it's the people of Scotland that are sovereign, as was defined in the court case in 1953, that you're prepared to throw away the sovereignty of the people of Scotland and allow Westminster to do whatever it likes. Well, frankly, that's not acceptable to the rest of us. How can you be Secretary of State for Scotland if you behave in such a line? That's not the Secretary of State for Scotland. That is the government's man in Scotland. Now we have reached... sit down. Sit down. No.
Order. Just before the right honourable gentleman continues, can I... order.
now is what was intended and is included in the and what people voted for in 1997 and is included in the devolution settlement. And if the honourable gentleman is so concerned about Scotland being dragged out of the European Union, why does he not join us in backing a people's vote to give the people a vote on the final deal?
I simply say to the honourable lady, if she wants to stay in Europe and if she wants to stay in the single market and the customs union, there is already a man.
And I just wanted to draw his attention to the words of Nicola Sturgeon at the Aberdeen conference, SNP conference in 2015, when she said she
the so-called Secretary of State for Scotland, he should be ashamed of himself. Mr. Speaker, our Scottish Parliament finds itself under threat of a power grab from the very party which opposed its creation in the first place. More than 2 decades after Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament, the UK Government's Withdrawal Bill constitutes the biggest power grab since devolution. The Secretary of State promised a powers bonanza to the Scottish Parliament, while his colleague, the DEFRA Secretary, even went as far as to suggest immigration powers could be devolved to Scotland. Despite that promise, the Secretary of State for Scotland consistently failed to name one power in that bonanza coming back to Scotland. In December 2017, the Secretary of State for Scotland promised that amendments would be made to the Withdrawal Bill during the report stage before going back on that promise and allowing amendments to be made only in the unelected House of Lords. The Secretary of State has not once apologised for the fact that this House never had that opportunity. This elected chamber never had the opportunity to discuss amendments to the Withdrawal Bill that affected devolution of Scotland, showing utter contempt for our Parliament and for our people. Since then, the Secretary of State has been missing in action, refusing to lead on an emergency debate on the Sewell Convention called by the SNP, following the refusal to allow time to debate Clause 15 once the Withdrawal Bill had returned from the Lords. If members are not convinced of his inadequacy for the job, then hear this. The Secretary of State removed all doubt as to his views when he recently said that Scotland is not a partner in the UK, not equal. That is exactly what this government thinks of the people of Scotland, and its actions reflect that sentiment. The Secretary of State can't stand up for Scotland as he does not recognise Scotland as a partner in the United Kingdom. He has unilaterally downgraded our role. It is little wonder he is without consequence in standing up for Scotland. Mr. Speaker, what a damning indictment of the Tory party.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman sets out his case now for independence, which is to be based on deceit and misrepresentation. I never once said, Mr. Speaker, and I have Hansard here to prove it,
that Scotland was not part of the United Kingdom, not a partner in the United Kingdom. What honourable members opposite claim is that Scotland is a partner of the United Kingdom because they want Scotland and the United Kingdom to be separate things. They are not. Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. Scotland is at the heart of the United Kingdom, and ultimately that's what the right honourable gentleman objects to.
Mr. Speaker, what we object to is a Secretary of State that can't do his job in standing up for the people of Scotland. And the simple fact of the matter is, what we're doing today is we're talking about the claim of right for Scotland. We're not arguing for independence of Scotland. That day will come. We're simply talking about the principle and where sovereignty lies. And we are affirming the rights of the people of Scotland to be sovereign. And everyone can see what is going on here is that the Conservative MPs seem to be denying the rights of the people to that sovereignty. Let me lay this challenge to the Conservatives here and now. We have placed a motion before you. Have the guts to come through the lobbies tonight with us, affirming the sovereignty of the Scottish people, or if you so dare, oppose that motion. Show you have the guts to stand in the face of the motion that we have in front of us. Because if you fail to do so, then it will be the accepted will of this House that we've accepted the sovereignty of the Scottish people. So tonight you have a choice. You can sit and chunter and shout and bawl and laugh as you've done since this debate started, or you can go through the lobbies later on and you can stand up for the people of Scotland, you can affirm the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, or you can flunk it. Because history has shown that every step of the way you've argued against the interests of the people of Scotland.
Just to simply say, this side never walked out and turned their backs on the people of Scotland from this Parliament, but your side did turn their back on the people of Scotland.
You know, the simple fact of the matter is that we were faced with a situation, and he should be ashamed, that the Conservative government pushed through the Withdrawal Bill that took powers from the Scottish Parliament without a debate in this House. And the honourable member and all his friends went through the lobbies to take these powers from the people of Scotland. I'm proud of the fact that it's the Scottish National Party that's standing up for the people of Scotland. What the Conservatives are doing is allowing Scotland to be walked all over, and the honourable gentleman and his friends are guilty as charged of having done that. Mr. Speaker, a party with no mandate to speak for Scotland but thinks it can do whatever it wants to Scotland and get away with it. They opposed devolution in the first place. They've consistently voted against Scotland's interests, and now they want to dismantle the rights of our Parliament, downgrading devolution and dismissing the views of the people of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland asked for none of this. They voted decisively against leaving the European Union, yet now they face the socio-economic chaos from a hard Tory Brexit. Before she became Prime Minister, Theresa May set out her view of a UK in which Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England continues to flourish side by side, but as equal partners. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the views of the people of Scotland are disregarded. Instead, the Prime Minister has shut out and silenced the people of Scotland from the Brexit debate. The Secretary of State for Scotland wasn't even invited to the meeting at Chequers where they discussed Brexit. His views were not called upon, inconsequential in the process that the UK Government was going through. Mr. Speaker, whilst the Scottish Parliament is not yet 20 years old, it has made remarkable achievements. From free education, personal care and prescriptions, world-leading climate change targets, the smoking ban, huge strides forward in attitudes towards sectarianism, sexual equality and multiculturalism. Meanwhile, waiting times are here. You know what? What you find is when you look at A&E in Scottish hospitals, the record is far better than the Conservative government in London. And the honourable member for Ayr, rather than doing down the health service in Scotland, should be talking up the successes of the Scottish Parliament, the government, in delivering for the people of Scotland. Meanwhile, in Westminster, The cruel and callous Tory policies such as the rape clause, the bedroom tax, austerity and, of course, Brexit stand in stark contrast to our approach. In Scotland, we do things differently, and this place needs to recognise that the first step is for Westminster to respect the will of the Scottish Parliament. Will this place do it? Will this House recognise that the Scottish Parliament has not given a consent motion to the Withdrawal Bill? Will this Parliament now recant and make sure the powers that have been grabbed are sent back to the Scottish Parliament? Because that's what the people of Scotland expect. You know, we were promised in 2014, with Gordon Brown saying that a no vote in the independence referendum would lead to changes offering as close to federalism as possible. In the end, nothing close to that was delivered. And before the Tories leaped from the benches, yes, we in the SNP respect the will of the Scottish people decided in 2014. But the claim of right is important because it allows for the sovereignty of Scotland to choose, and that means if Scotland decides it wants change, then it should be respected. Why should Conservatives stand in the way of the sovereignty and the rights of the Scottish people? And why should Scottish Conservatives allow that to happen? It's their responsibility not to stand up for their constituents, their needs and their wishes. Mr Speaker, the Scottish Government was elected in May 2016 on a manifesto which said in relation to independence, the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. Mr Speaker, given events since 2016, there is therefore no question about the legitimacy of the Scottish Parliament and the people of Scotland to consider the question of independence. Everything has changed. Now, this Parliament today must show that it understands, recognises and respects the rights of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, including during this time of significant change. I urge all members to defend the interests of the people of Scotland and to vote to recognise the claim of the right of the Scottish people. Our people's sovereignty, Scotland's sovereignty, must be and will be respected.
Order. The question is as on the order paper. I call the Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I begin by sharing the good wishes expressed towards George Reid, the former presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament. I voted for George Reid to be presiding officer in 1999 and again in 2003 because he was a man of substance. George Reid wasn't a man when he was an MP that would have come to this chamber and dished out abuse at another member and then failed to take an intervention. He wasn't a man who would have come to this chamber and distorted the words of a fellow MP so that he could put forward his case. He was a man of principle who argued, and I'm sure still does argue, for independence on the basis of a principle, not deceit, abuse and misrepresentation. Mr Speaker, this debate is a missed opportunity. We could have been discussing the future of Scotland. We could have spent the time talking about our plans to realise the sea of opportunity presented to our fishermen from leaving the EU. We could have talked about city deals or our industrial strategy. Instead, we have this debate which says nothing about the future of Scotland, but everything about the SNP and their obsession with independence. They're like a broken record. It's less than 2 years since Parliament debated the claim of right at the behest of the SNP. Of course, in that intervening time, we have had an electoral test in Scotland, a general election. The result, as I recall it, was SNP losing 21 seats and 12 Conservative gains. That debate was a charade then, an excuse to talk about independence, and it's a charade today. But what else, Mr Speaker, would we expect? The leader of the SNP Westminster Group set out his position very clearly exactly a week ago. Nothing else matters to them. Not improving Scotland's sluggish economy, certainly not preparing Scotland for Brexit. For the Right Honourable Gentleman, Brexit is nothing more than a clear roadmap to a second independence referendum. That's his stated priority.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. The Right Honourable Gentleman is arguing that this debate is all about a second independence referendum and about the SNP. Can I ask him this? Does he agree with Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations?
Mr Speaker, I'm sure that I do agree with Article 1 of the Charter of the United Kingdom, and I believe in people's right to self-determination. And I believe that the people of Scotland have set out clearly what they wanted in the 2014 independence referendum. The problem is that SNP cannot accept that. They cannot accept that most inconvenient of truths for them. The people of Scotland exercised the right to choose their future in 2014. They were very clear they wished to remain in the United Kingdom. Shamefully, the SNP are determined to ignore them, the people they claim to represent. If the SNP truly believed in the rights of the Scottish people, would they not accept that result? Would they not listen to the Scottish people? The claim of right in 1989 played an important part in the campaign for a Scottish Parliament. It was about devolution. The authors were explicit in their aims. And as we've already heard, Mr Speaker, the Scottish National Party acknowledged as much when they refused to sign it. They refused to sign it because it had nothing to do with their own cause of independence. So in this debate, we have not only the claim of right to consider, we have the claim of rewriting history, and it's a claim that's often levelled at the SNP. So rather than misrepresenting it as a means of justifying a second unwanted independence referendum, the SNP should reflect on what it really means. It means the UK Government respected the right of the people of Scotland to choose whether to remain part of the United Kingdom. It means we worked with the Scottish Government to facilitate the referendum in 2014. It means that together we delivered a legal, fair and decisive vote. That decision of the people of Scotland, reaffirming their desire to have two parliaments and two governments, should be respected. Not at this stage. The UK Government has consistently supported devolution. After the 2014 vote, we established the Smith Commission with a view to expanding the powers of the Scottish Parliament. We delivered Lord Smith's recommendations in full, adding wide-ranging new powers over tax and welfare into the devolution settlement and establishing Holyrood as one of the most powerful devolved legislatures in the world. We are committed to working closely with the Scottish Government to transfer the last of the new powers smoothly and securely. And devolution will be strengthened further as we leave the EU and powers that have been held in Brussels for 40 years flow to Holyrood. It's a strange kind of power grab that leaves the grabbed with more power than ever. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been disappointed, but not in the slightest bit surprised by the SNP's power grab scaremongering, hot air and their grandstanding stunts. But I did get a surprise when the whole confection of this alleged power grab should be shot down by none other than Nicola Sturgeon during her reshuffle last week. I need more ministers, she said, because of all the extra powers the Scottish Government must exercise. Incredible. The UK Government is working closely with the Scottish Government as powers return from Brussels. And I don't think over 80 powers returning directly to the Scottish Parliament should be scoffed at. It's a real opportunity for Scotland to continue to shape what is best for Scotland in the Scottish Parliament. Throughout this process, we followed and we will follow the Sewell Convention, one of the pillars of the devolution settlement. It's a cast-iron commitment, not difficult to make, because unlike the SNP, we believe in devolution. The people of Scotland voted for devolution in 1997. We accepted their decision and embraced devolution. The people of Scotland reaffirmed their support for remaining in the United Kingdom in 2014. In every election to the Scottish Parliament since 1999, a majority of voters have backed parties which support devolution. How much democracy do the SNP need before they get the message?
Was Ruth Davidson not spot on when she said after the independence referendum that it was entirely legitimate, even honourable, for the SNP to continue to argue for Scottish independence?
Indeed, and it is perfectly legitimate and even honourable to argue the case for independence, but not on the pretext that you're standing up for devolution, something which you absolutely and clearly don't believe in. Now, contrast the SNP response to the independence referendum. They've neither accepted nor supported devolution, other than as a stepping stone to independence. They don't want it to succeed. They seek any excuse to undermine it. Within minutes of the result of the EU referendum being declared, Nicola Sturgeon put her civil servants to work drawing up plans for a second independence referendum, and in the same breath airbrushing out of history the 1 million people in Scotland who voted to leave the EU. 500,000 of them probably SNP supporters who are to be completely disregarded and whose views don't count at all. They've not sought to deliver Brexit. That would be respecting the votes across all of the United Kingdom, something they find impossible. But they've sought to weaponise Brexit in their campaign for independence. I'm pleased to say that the Prime Minister has been very clear about their obsession with independence. The PM said last year, now is not the time, and our position is exactly the same today. And now will not be the time in the autumn or the time when we leave the EU in the spring of next year. We will respect the wishes of the Scottish people, which, as the opinion polls have consistently shown, have not changed since 2014. The Nationalists should do the same.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He makes much of the facts of the result of the EU referendum and refuses to accept the result in Scotland was different. OK, let's for a moment assume that he's correct. Would he care to comment on John Major's analysis of the EU referendum, where he says many electors now know they were misled and the Leave campaign was verging on the squalid?
Madam Deputy Speaker, people have strong views in relation to the EU referendum, but a vote was held over the United Kingdom, as it was clear from the outset that it would be. It was a United Kingdom vote, and the majority of people across the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU, and I respect that decision. Yes, I will.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Would you agree with me that the crucial problem here is that members opposite appear to be completely unable to distinguish between the will of the Scottish people and the whim of the Scottish National Party?
Indeed, my honourable friend is right, and it is because this is all about independence. Everything we see being put to us this evening, the complaints about the current constitutional arrangements, it's not about standing up for those arrangements. It's not about standing up for Scotland in the devolution settlement. It's about finding a way to put forward another and yet another argument for independence. The SNP are ignoring the wishes of the Scottish people, and they are losing the argument. In fact, they are no longer arguing at all, except among themselves. And the Right Honourable Gentleman's speech was as much for an SNP conference for a core audience in the SNP as it was for this chamber. I don't know, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you remember the big tent which the SNP promised to put up after the defeat in the 2014 referendum to encourage more people to support their cause. Their promise to listen for once to the majority of Scots, well, the big tent has been torn down. All we have now is manufactured grievances. They invent, they misrepresent, they abuse. They try to shout down those who disagree with them. They glory in childish stunts which embarrass the people they purport to represent. If we believe in democracy and the principle contained in the claim of right, the most important thing we must do is to listen to the people. We must respect the votes they have cast. We must listen when they say they don't want another second divisive independence referendum. I'm quite happy this evening to support the motion. I would have preferred if the amendment had been added, because I do believe that the people of Scotland determine their constitutional future. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, they have. They want to stay in the United Kingdom.
Leslie Laird.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have no doubt that today's debate will quite simply sum up for what passes as political leadership in Scotland. Indeed, we have already heard the gist of it from the Right Honourable Member from Ross, Skye and Lochaber. For the majority of people in Scotland, they are entirely sick of it. The people of Scotland are stuck between two competing nationalist governments, and it results in debates just like the one we are going to hear tonight. For honourable members who are not from Scotland, if people in the UK are fed up listening to the talk of Brexit, which only occurred 2 years ago, just think about how fed up the people in Scotland are every time they hear the word independence. Before 2014, depending on who you listen to, we were told that the independence referendum was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, or once in a lifetime. Even in its white paper, section 557, page 566, and this turns out to be one more piece of proof that the white paper was a work of fiction, cobbled together at taxpayers' expense.
Would she allow an intervention on that point?
Yep.
I want to come to cobbled together. What was Gordon Brown's description of Scotland getting the closest thing to federalism possible if it voted no, if not cobbled together?
Well, I think, as members have touched on, the vow was fully delivered, and the fact that you the fact that you've had to increase your cabinet so much in the last few years just simply reflects the fact that you've got more powers. You're recognised as the most powerful independent parliament. I shall move on. Yet here we are today, not 4 years after the referendum, and the issue has never gone away. Labour's position on the claim of rights is unambiguous. We helped to write it, we signed it, and we supported it in the past, and we will support it in the future. The claim of rights states that the Scottish people have the sovereign right to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. Determining the form of government best suited to their needs is exactly what the people of Scotland already do. And that is exactly what they did in 2014 in the independence referendum. In 2014, people in Scotland were faced with a choice: to leave the United Kingdom and have the Scottish Government as their sole government, or to remain in the United Kingdom and have two governments. They chose the latter, 55% to 45%.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. Of course, the motion talks about the claim of right rather than the votes that we've had previously. I wonder, it's something that Labour used to support. I wonder if she might touch on it now and whether she feels the position that she might be able to support the motion this evening.
Labour will always be happy to support the claim of rights. I've just outlined that position, and if the honourable gentleman allows me to continue, I will expand further on that point. The form of government that people in Scotland chose was that of dual governance, something that the SNP have failed to accept. It's not what's best for Scotland that they are interested in, but what's best for their single obsession. And if you think otherwise, the launch of a petition today on rewriting the claim of right to reference only independence should leave no one in any doubt about the SNP's priorities. The Labour Party supported the current claim of right. In fact, I'd argue that the claim of right was instrumental in the Scottish Constitutional Convention that led to the devolution in Scotland. And I think that fact goes to the heart of the issue that we face today. There were two parties that did not sign the claim of right in 1989, the SNP and the Conservatives. So why did they not sign? Well, the Tories never signed it because they didn't believe in devolution, and as their recent performance shows, they still don't. The SNP never signed it because they've never been interested in devolution. It's always been, and still is, all about independence. The irony now is that the SNP are asking us to support the principles of something that they never signed up for in the first place. But again, I guess we are where we are. And let me talk about where we are today. This is their half-day debate. It's one of only 3 opposition debates that the SNP get a year. Is it not extraordinary that of all the things they could have used this time to talk about, that this is what they've opted for? Absolutely extraordinary, except, of course, when it's seen through the narrow prism of their obsession. Politics will always be priorities. I'll give way.
It is extraordinary that the SNP have chosen, as the Honourable Lady is saying, their half-day debate to be on this subject. What's even more extraordinary is the performance of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the SNP. I have to say that it is with great sadness that I reflect on how diminished a personage he now is in the eyes of this House, because of the way in which he has conducted himself in these debates. He has been largely impolite, has shouted abuse across the floor of the House. And would the Honourable Lady agree with me that the standards of Parliament demand that we set a high standard?
Order. Leslie Laird.
Well, I think the Speaker set out very clearly the standards that are expected of all members, and as the Right Honourable Member highlighted, the public is indeed watching. The public is indeed watching. So the SNP then, the irony now is the SNP are asking, so let me talk about where we are today. In this half-day debate, it's only one of 3 opposition debates. It's absolutely extraordinary. Politics is ever always about priorities. But by neglecting so many serious issues today, the SNP have shown contempt for the real issue and the issues of their constituents. They could have chosen to talk about issues of welfare as they affect Scotland, like the unfair treatment of terminally ill patients, like the MND group that have come to London, even in the bitter snow, to plead for reform of the assessment programme. They could have chosen to talk about the fact that 52% of people living in poverty in Scotland are actually in work. They could have chosen to talk about the 1.8 people on 0 hours contracts. They could have chosen to talk about the unprecedented growth in the use of food banks. In my own constituency, Kirkcaldy Food Bank has seen its spend go from £3,000 a month to now £8,000 a month. They could have chosen to talk about the 1 in 4 children living in poverty in Scotland and could have actually supported Scottish Labour's amendment to the bill in the Scottish Parliament, but they didn't. They could have chosen to talk about the thousands of 1950s women who've had their pension callously and cruelly cut by the Conservative government. They could have chosen to talk about the need for investment in shipbuilding in Rosyth and Govan and the UK Government's decision to put the Fleet Solid Support Ships contract out to international tender. They could have chosen to talk about industrial strategy or lack of it and how this impacts on Scottish jobs. Or the hostile immigration policy that has seen Georgie, a 10-year-old orphan boy, facing uncertainty, and also the Kamal family going on hunger strike, as raised by my right honourable colleague, the member for Glasgow North East. Real people with real life issues needing MPs like us to use this platform to raise these issues. But no, instead they choose to talk about what they always talk about. Instead they choose to debate the only thing that truly matters to them, the Constitution and indeed F2. Yes, I will, Deputy.
Lady for giving way. She's just listed a number of subjects that she wants to be debated. Can she confirm which of them Labour will be choosing for its opposition day next week?
I'll be happy to confirm that to the gentleman after this debate. I'm focused on the matter at hand. But we are where we are. Labour is opposed to a second referendum. People in Scotland made their decision and they decided to remain as part of the UK. And the current YouGov poll from June shows that absolutely nothing has changed. It's still 55 to 45. And in light of the SNP Growth Commission paper, Labour would not stand by and see the people of Scotland being subjected to at least another 10 years of austerity just to balance the books. The reality of the Cuts Commission is there for all to see. Read it and weep about what the SNP are prepared to inflict upon the Scottish people, all in the name of independence. My colleagues in the Scottish Parliament will always oppose it. But Labour is clear that the fight against IndyRef 2 is not for this place, because at that point, let us be clear, it is about process. If people in Scotland elect to the Scottish Parliament parties who wish to hold a second referendum, then it is not for Westminster to deny them that right. That is exactly what the claim of right is about. And if we were to vote against that, then we would not be upholding the principle of the claim of right. I would now like to make some points to the benches opposite and ask them to do something that they have failed to do so far, which is listen. So I was delighted that you indicated that you were indeed prepared to listen this evening. By your actions, this flaming of the fires of a second independence referendum is being fanned. The complete inability of the UK government to negotiate Brexit, layered on top of the inability of the UK government to engage in a meaningful way with the Scottish government on Brexit, has led us down this path. This is what has led to the constitutional bind that we find ourselves in. For a party that claims to be the protectors of the Union, I find this astounding. Members opposite know that the SNP's cause is always furthered by grievance. So why would the UK government allow grievances to occur and be exploited when they have it in their gift to address the concerns? Because Scotland's voice has been shut out of the Brexit negotiations. No joint ministerial committee for 8 months. Discussions broken down entirely between the governments. No debate on the final devolution amendments because...
I know that some on the benches opposite, but I wouldn't have thought the honourable lady would in that case want to sort of talk up this point that relations have broken down, that the governments aren't in contact. There's a meeting of the JMC tomorrow.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted, and let's hope it's more productive than the last 2 meetings that were cancelled. The Scottish Parliament overwhelmingly voted to withhold voting of the bill, yet the government is still not listening. So I simply say to members opposite and to the Secretary of State, what did the UK government expect to happen? Our constituents don't want us to be standing in the House of Commons giving each other a history lesson. They want us to be here defending them and addressing the gross inequality that we see in our society. And as we all know, we don't have to look very far to see that. Independence won't solve the problems that we face in our society. I would argue that based on the Cuts Commission, the inequality that we see in our society would become even greater. Madam Deputy Speaker, people in Scotland do have the right to determine the government best suited to their needs, and the choice is becoming very, very clear. A vote for the Tories is a vote for austerity, and a vote for the SNP is a vote for austerity. A vote for the Labour Party is a vote for jobs, for investment in health and education, and a different way of doing things that addresses the fundamental issues that matter to people day in and day out. Labour has committed to ending this austerity junket, and we commit ourselves to an economy that works for the people rather than simply working for the economy. We have committed to major investment in Scotland. In March, my right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, detailed how Scotland would benefit to the tune of £70 billion over the course of 10 years if there were a Labour government across the UK. £30 billion of that would be from Barnett consequentials, meaning greater investment in our schools, our NHS, our local communities and our police and fire services. The only way that the people in Scotland will see the change that their society requires is from a radical Labour government that has the political will to tackle poverty and inequality, extend public ownership and redistribute power from the few to the many. That is the economic and social transformation Scotland urgently needs, and that will not come from another referendum on leaving the UK. The sovereign people of Scotland have already clearly expressed their view. It's time to respect it.
Order. Before I call the next speaker, it will be obvious to the House that a great many people wish to speak this evening and that we have limited time. There will therefore be an initial time limit of 8 minutes, though that might be reduced. Now, before I call the next person to speak, I hesitate always to interrupt someone when they're in the flow of their rhetoric. But it's been very difficult not to do so when several people this evening have used the word "you" when they're talking about other people in this chamber. In this chamber, the word "you" means the chair. There's a good reason for not saying "you," because "you" is a very direct, personal criticism, whereas the honourable gentleman or the honourable lady is once removed, and that's how we do things in this chamber. And it's very important to keep that distance when we have a heated debate. So although I haven't interrupted anybody so far for the use of the word "you," I will from now on. I'm allowed to say you. You have been warned. Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And if I can use the word "you," it's great to see you in the chair for this debate about Scotland, because it is an important debate for us to be having. I have to say, I love this place. I love the chamber. Well, you know, the honourable member says, I love the new camp. Yes, I do. It was a great honour and privilege for me as someone from Murray who started on football pitches at Forest Academy to reach the new camp. And I'm grateful. I'll come to the honourable member. I will give way. But I'm very grateful to the support I received in Murray from people who were not impressed by the antics from the SNP, who forced me to give up a lifetime ambition. Now, that's happened, and I accept it, and I'm delighted to be here tonight to do that. But to make petty remarks like that is really following in the footsteps of the right honourable gentleman for Ross, Skye and Lochaber. And I think, as I give way, I hope he will consider his tone before he continues in this debate.
He used to be in the new camp, but the point was that the night that he was in the new camp, he wasn't here scrutinising the government on universal credit.
So that debate on universal credit was one I was never voting. I was never speaking in. But in terms of a vote that night, it was very interesting because no one voted against the motion that night on universal credit. It was a debate called for by the SNP and manufactured a vote. And I think we'll all be looking very closely about manufactured votes if there is, consensus in the chamber tonight for what we are debating. But I do want to mention a couple of points to begin with. I agree wholeheartedly with the comments by my honourable friend for Stirling. I started off by saying I love this place, I love this chamber, I love these benches. But tonight, for the first time, I haven't enjoyed it. I like the cut and thrust of debate like anyone else. But the personal attacks we saw from the right honourable gentleman for Ross, Skye and Lochaber to the Secretary of State for Scotland. You can disagree with the office, you can disagree with what the Secretary of State is doing, but to get so personal, to play the man rather than playing the ball, I think does not serve the right honourable member well and does not serve his party well. And what we are seeing with the attacks from SNP members, when I tried to intervene on the right honourable gentleman throwing his arm at me, disrespectfully, to be called out by the Speaker for his actions. I hope, after this Opposition Day debate, he will reflect on the way he performs in this chamber. Because Scotland is watching, and Scotland wants to see its politicians in both parliaments working together where they can and constructively disagreeing where that has to happen. But to do it in such a personal way, I hope his silence at the moment is to reflect on what he said, but more importantly, how he said it, and I will give way.
For the honourable gentleman giving way, I want to reiterate that my opposition to the Conservatives and to the Secretary of State is entirely political. There's nothing personal I've said. But I'll ask the honourable gentleman to reflect on this. It was a matter of record that 2 weeks ago I was asked to commit suicide by a Conservative Member of Parliament, and I'll say this to the honourable member as well, and I haven't raised this in the House yet. But last night, while sitting on these benches, witnessed by other people, I was told in very explicit terms where a four-letter word that was used previously by a Cabinet Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, that begins with F. So I'm not going to take any lectures from the government benches on how to behave, because I'm the one that's been abused by his colleagues by being told to commit suicide and by being told to F off. I'm not going to take any lectures from him.
Hear, hear, hear.
And that went down really...
Order. Let's just make it clear. No clapping. Just shouts of hear, hear. Fine to support. No clapping. Douglas Ross.
The point I was trying to get at is the mask is slipping with the right honourable gentleman and with the SNP. And he mentions actions that took place in this House last night. I hope his own members reflected on what a member who's not here, so I will not name that honourable lady, did at the conclusion of last night's debate in the actions towards my honourable friend, the member for Stirling. And I know that will have been noted by members of the SNP group, and that cannot be allowed to continue either in this House. But I also want to say 24 hours is a long time in politics, because yesterday, Madam Deputy Speaker, in a debate about the economy of Scotland, about the amount of money Scotland gets from Westminster to spend in the devolved administrations, could only attract 2 SNP MPs. Yet a debate about the Constitution, about their obsession with independence, can attract far more. However, I was very surprised, really surprised, that at the start of the Right Honourable Gentleman's speech tonight, there were only 16 SNP MPs. So half of their parliamentary party couldn't even be bothered to be here for the start of their Opposition Day debate. And I wonder if that's because, like many of us, they disagree with the subject that has been taken forward tonight. I will give way in a moment. I wonder if many of the SNP MPs wish we were discussing other things. Today, of all days, when the UK Government launched their white paper on fisheries, we could have been discussing fisheries. This would have been a great opportunity for the SNP, very topical today, to talk about fisheries. But they didn't want to do that because of their policy on fisheries. They lost seats like Murray and 20 other seats around Scotland because of their policy on fisheries, which says we don't want to be these powers going to Westminster, we want to give them straight back to Europe. We could have been speaking about education, because the SNP quite often speak in this place about this is what we will do in Scotland, so the UK Government ministers should replicate it in the UK. Well, I'm happy to give way to any of the ladies that are trying to have a conversation at the moment, or I'll continue with my speech, because I want to mention education particularly. Because quite often here, their spokespeople and their members stand up and ask the government benches to do exactly what we're doing in Scotland. Well, I hope they never do that again with education. Because in Scotland, your #1 priority, that your First Minister, the leader of the SNP, said this will get all our attention, has had to withdraw their flagship bill on education. That's how big a priority education is for the SNP. And what about higher education? The First Minister for Scotland nominated someone who had deplorable views on those of transgender people. Deplorable views on black people, on Jews. And that's why they can't discuss education in their Opposition Day debate as well. And this is what I'm putting forward.
Order. Point of order. Speaker, can I have your guidance? It appears that this gentleman who's speaking is not paying any attention to the motion to be debated before this House. Could I have your guidance on whether his rambling remarks are actually in order? I understand the point the Honourable Lady is making, and several of her colleagues have been gesticulating something similar. I have been paying careful attention to what the Honourable Gentleman is saying, and I have every confidence that, having introduced various other topics about which this debate is not, that he is now going to come to the substance of the debate and the motion before us, which is the claim of right. Douglas Ross.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I am coming to that. But it's important that the Secretary of State for Scotland, the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, discuss the key issues that we should be debating today. And I will, just before I move on, refer to a comment by the Right Honourable Gentleman for Ross-Ganglach-Aber, who said we on these benches should be praising the NHS. Well, I would have also liked to have a debate about the NHS today, because I'm quite happy to praise, well, the Honourable Lady for Ayrshire and Arran expresses great displeasure about that. But can the Honourable Lady understand my anger today as a Member of Parliament for Murray, who got a phone call from NHS Grampian to be told that for the next 12 to 18 months, because the way the SNP have overseen the NHS in Scotland, pregnant women will have to travel to Aberdeen or Inverness to give birth. That is an important issue. And whether you're in this place or in Holyrood, you shouldn't try to talk the honourable and learned lady should not try to talk me down when I am standing up for pregnant women who are faced with these concerns. I will give way.
The Honourable Gentleman has just been busy telling us how much he loves this place. But if he wants to debate the state of the Scottish NHS, he should be in the Scottish Parliament. Does he not understand the difference between reserved and devolved powers?
Madam Deputy Speaker, this is again the reaction we get from the SNP. If you disagree with the SNP, if you say something they don't like, you don't understand things. I'm too thick to understand what is reserved and what is devolved. What I do understand is I am a representative of my constituency. And if my constituents come to me raising these concerns, I think I should be able to shout and loudly shout about them in this chamber, as colleagues could in Holyrood as well. But I will come to what we are debating here today about the claim of right, because well, the Right Honourable Gentleman took 55 minutes to make his speech on this point, and I have 8 minutes to make mine. But it is important we consider the motion today. The claim of right is very clear, and it's one we all support, that the Scottish people are sovereign and can choose the Parliament that best suits their needs. The Parliament that best suits their needs. And we give them the opportunity. The opportunity was in 2014. When the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Gentleman, all the Honourable Members opposite voted and campaigned for Scotland to be separated from the rest of the United Kingdom, and I and others on these benches and across Scotland and the UK voted for Scotland to remain an integral part of the United Kingdom. That decision has been taken. And I went into the polling station in Murray and I went to the count knowing, I thought, that it was a once-in-a-generation event. Because that's what we were promised by the former leader of the SNP, by the current leader of the SNP, a once-in-a-generation event. But that's not good enough for them, because SNP members are obsessed about independence. They will only speak about independence. They won't speak about the healthcare, about education, about important issues for my Murray constituents and for Scotland. And they are talking Scotland down by obsessing about independence rather than standing up for their constituents.
Marion Fellows.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Today's debate is not just important for the people of Scotland, but it has great importance to the many peoples and nations throughout the world, notably our friends in Catalonia and the political prisoners there, to whom I'd like to pay my respects, because at the heart of today's debate is human rights, specifically a people's right to self-determination. This is enshrined in international law under Article 1 of the UN's Charter, which states the purposes of the United Nations are to develop friendly relations amongst nations as based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. I do not believe that anyone in this place, not even the Tory members on the benches opposite, would say that Scotland's people are not a nation. The only conclusion that can be drawn then is that Scotland, its people and Parliament have the power to decide their own future. As the motion states, and I am speaking to the motion, It is the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, and no one else's right. I respect the opinion of people here who believe that Scotland should remain in the UK, and yes, Scotland did vote to do so, but this was before it voted to remain in the EU. I would ask these same people to respect the will of the Scottish people on that matter.
Would the Honourable Lady allow? I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, because what Scotland voted for was for the United Kingdom to remain as part of the European Union. I voted for that. I campaigned for that. I did not then want to see my vote being used as a lever to break up the United Kingdom. So when the Honourable Lady tries to do that, can I tell her she doesn't do it in my name, and she doesn't do it in the name of the majority of my constituents?
The honourable gentleman, and I no doubt you'll realise this, and he's looking very angrily at me at the moment.
Yes. It's just my natural expression. You can't hold it against me.
Well, in that case, I apologise. But we will never agree on this. And I think we're talking about the sovereign right of the Scottish people. I choose not to divide my country. I love my country, and I know that when I stand out in Motherwell and Wishaw and I talk to people in Motherwell and Wishaw, the one thing that they really love is their Scottish Parliament. And that's partly why, this is why we are talking about the claim of right. Anyway, I want to move on. We can exchange figures and numbers and percentages, but what is important is that decisions were made by the Scottish people based on the circumstances of the time. This is the very nature of democracy, from elections to referenda. Today's political reality is that there have been major upheavals to the fundamental political and economic circumstances of modern-day Scotland, and it is on this basis that Scotland must again reconsider its options. Scotland is at a crossroads. We must not only decide what form of government best suits our needs, but decide what type of country we are. This discussion is being had in homes, communities and workplaces across Scotland as people slowly but surely decide. People in Scotland see the Prime Minister walking hand in hand with Donald Trump. They see the rich get richer while their communities and neighbours struggle. They see this place treat Scotland with utter disdain, giving devolution only 15 minutes of consideration, time totally taken up by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. With foreign wars, nuclear weapons in the Clyde, food banks used through the roof and precarious low-pay employment, people in Scotland imagine something better for their lives that Westminster has failed time and time again to deliver. Peace, security and greater power over the decisions that affect their lives.
Would the Honourable Lady give way?
No, I'm going to try and continue because I am only 3 minutes left. Scotland is not a country that is quick to take to the streets, but what recent independence demonstrations have shown, as have the demonstrations of the past against Westminster's poll tax and Thatcher's decimation of Scottish industry, is that once Scotland has made up its mind, it will continue to pursue its interests in the face of adversity. For anyone who opposes Scotland's sovereign right, they are exposing a truth widely held in Scotland, and indeed by the Secretary of State for Scotland, that we are not an equal partner in the UK, that we must ask permission to make our own decisions. I only have 3 minutes. I cannot give way. That a democratically elected Parliament's decision to hold a referendum, the most direct form of democracy imaginable, that we must ask Westminster to rubber stamp it. For anyone who recognises and celebrates the no vote of 2014, but would then seek to undermine Scotland's sovereignty by discrediting any future vote, they expose a crucial contradiction in their argument and don't understand the pride that the Scottish people take in their Parliament. And look at it. I want to finish this.
The Honourable Lady give way?
No, I'm going to continue. Whilst the UK Government seeks to evaporate the Sewell Convention and rely on outdated principles of Westminster sovereignty, the people of Scotland will be the ones who decide their legitimate government and where their legitimate government and interests lie. No politician, party or parliament can. It's about the Scottish people. So despite the outcome of this debate, it will always be the case that Scotland's sovereignty does not need to be recognised by parties that Scotland rejects or by Westminster, but its sovereignty only needs to be recognised by the people of Scotland themselves. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was sorry to see that the amendment that was tabled wasn't taken, but as the claim of rights exists, then the only thing that is decisive is the will of the Scottish people that is expressed through elections and referenda. And that will is fluid and changing. You only need to look at opinion polls that have been taken since the Brexit, since 2014, all the way through. The minority Conservative government is well aware of these polls. It is undemocratic to bind Scotland or any other country to the decisions of the past in order to protect the interests of the Tory party.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I begin by repeating very quickly how disappointed I was in the performance of the leader of the SNP. And I mean that sincerely, because he is someone for whom I have had respect since arriving in this House. And I would also like to put it on the record that I am fully aware that it is the people of Stirling who are my boss. And they put me here. And of course they can remove me from here. But they put me here on the basis of a manifesto that included a commitment from my party to work constructively to see our country progress from being a member of the European Union to leaving the European Union. And that is what I am here to do, and it is a privilege to do so. I was reminded earlier today by the member for Hereford and South Herefordshire, who is not in his place, of course, that the saying of Adam Smith in relation to the Union. He described the Union as a measure from which infinite good has been derived to this country, and when he said this country, of course, he meant Scotland. Now, constitutional historians and scholars of religious tumult of the 16th century Scotland will realise the foundation of the ideas in the claim of right come from the works of George Buchanan on contractual monarchy. And George Buchanan was from Killearn, which is a village in my constituency in the west, and a superb place to visit. I can heartily recommend the Three Sisters Bakery when you make your visit to Killearn. And I don't know, Mr. Speaker, whether it's appropriate for me to refer to George Buchanan as a deceased person as my constituent, but he's buried in the Kirk of Greyfriars in Edinburgh. But he was born, he taught and he preached in Stirling. And in Killearn there's a monument to its famous son and for his work in establishing a constitutional framework for Scotland that would firmly allow the Scots to be governed by Presbyterianism. His assertion, appealing to biblical precedent, was that kings are in a contract with their people and that they have a right, nay, a responsibility, to remove irresponsible, ungodly and tyrannical kings, lest the wrath of the Almighty fall upon the people. And there's a great obelisk that dominates Killearn's skyline, which is a testament to this great constitutional theorist whose thoughts dominated Scottish politics in the 16th and 17th century. Now, there are thoughts, these are the thoughts that the writers, the preachers, the revolutionaries of the Scottish Reformation espoused. Unlike the English, our Reformation was bottom-up, inspired by the people rather than top-down, imposed by a tyrannical Tudor monarch. And preachers like Knox and Melville and Henderson fought for the idea that the people should be able to set the direction of their country. So let's be clear. Yes, I will.
The honourable gentleman's party wishes to take back control from the European Union. Why are they doing so and giving it to the episcopacy of the Church of England in the House of Lords?
Of course, it's not the 1689 claim of right that's being debated here today, but the 1989 one. The two are closely related, as both make reference to sovereignty resting squarely with the people, and I will vote for the motion tonight. These ideas build on the work of George Buchanan, and this idea of sovereignty imbued with the righteous principle of vox populi, vox dei. The claim of right is specific and relates to the establishment of a Scottish Assembly, as it was then called, a promise delivered by the referendum of 1997, which returned a resounding yes vote. The principle is extendable but requires careful consideration. The principle of popular sovereignty must always be used carefully. We should always seek to protect the views and interests of minorities. We don't have to look back very far in our history to see where popular sentiment has been used to justify some of the worst acts of oppression against minorities. Let's not forget that 85% of Scots opposed the recommendations of the Wolfenden Report in 1957, compared to near 51% in England. This fear of popular will led to homosexuality in Scotland remaining illegal until 1980. Now, I belong to a church which has historically seen a great deal of persecution out of fear, misunderstanding and prejudice. I understand only too well the prejudices that can be used by politicians to incite bigotry. When politicians feed on our worst fears and play to the crowd, they whip up a monster that is often uncontrollable. They do so with the excuse of projecting the popular will. I saw that last week with bigotry expressed against my constituents, especially those who voted for me, with the so-called All Under One banner march in Stirling being led by a banner that stated "Tory scum out." As politicians, and by the way, that parade was attended by elected members of the Scottish Parliament, and I think of this place too. I will, one more time.
For giving way. You mentioned a few moments ago that the majority of Scots back in the 50s had opposed the Wolfenden Report, seeming to make that an argument against popular sovereignty. But didn't the majority of people in this House for many years oppose the emancipation of homosexual men? And wasn't what brought about the emancipation of homosexual men human rights and adherence to the Convention of Human Rights, which his party seemed to oppose? So it's not about popular sovereignty, about parliamentary sovereignty, it's about the rule of law.
I think the honourable and learned lady knows full well the point I'm trying to make. As politicians, it is our job to... Well, it shouldn't worry the honourable lady. As politicians, it is our job to lead well and not to pander to the worst instincts of people, and to protect the principle that minority views and opinions must be respected. And we have to remember that we are here not to follow instructions from our constituents, but to lead. We have to make the case for a better country, a more tolerant country, and a country that respects all. This representative democracy that we have in our country is worth preserving. It is the representative democracy that had gone against popular sentiment in leading social change in our country, and long may it continue to do so. Yet the popular will must always be in our minds. Policy making by referendum is impractical, and it also does not give an opportunity to see real social change and risks the protection of minorities. In the history of our country, we have lately been through an unprecedented number of referenda. They have been constitutional in nature. Since 1975, people in Scotland have been through 6 referenda. Europe, Scotland, Scotland, electoral reform, Scotland and Europe. In other lands with different constitutional setups, referenda are more regular and more established in constitutional law. The Scottish referendum of 1997 still required an act of this Parliament to set up the Scottish Parliament. This House is passing legislation to interpret and undertake the popular instruction of the people to leave the European Union. The principle of respecting the will of the people is one that I agree with fundamentally. Whether it be the people of the United Kingdom voting to leave the EU, or the people of Scotland voting to keep the United Kingdom together, I agree wholeheartedly with the principle of respecting the will of the people. It is for government to remember this, and the SNP government in Edinburgh agitating for a second independence referendum is a betrayal of the principle of popular sovereignty. When the people have spoken, as they did, it is time for government to shut up. When I speak to people in my constituency, they talk about Indy Ref 2 and they tell me they want the SNP to stop talking about that and get on with running the country. And when they talk about leaving the EU, they tell me that the government should get on with it. It is for government to get on with it. This debate feels like the exact opposite of this. Debating these somewhat obscure to most people constitutional matters seems like navel-gazing rather than focusing on the real work of government. People want government to work together, and they want government to be effective so that they can get on with their lives unencumbered by constant politics. We need governmental systems that allow for this, for all levels of government, Scottish, UK and local government, to work together to build a future for our country. And as I've said many times before, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am confident that the work of our Stirling and Clackmannanshire City Region deal, by showing a true partnership between Holyrood, Westminster and our local councils, will bear fruit. It will build a common set of economic objectives and do so by people working together. We need similar partnership working to be implemented elsewhere. On policy frameworks, we need systems that allow for decision-making without gridlock. We need democratic oversight and efficient government. But the rancour and grievance that is generated by the SNP is unhelpful to all of this. And I have to say, largely, this debate is unhelpful to all of this. Now, let me conclude with this. This is a debate on what is an obscure statement. It has virtually no impact on the day-to-day lives of my constituents that I am here to serve. No doubt many members will find much to debate and discuss over the constitutional efficacy of the claim of right, whether popular sovereignty is right or wrong, drawing heavily on legal precedent and historical principles. But I would rather focus on improving the lives of my constituents and having a down-to-earth working government. Let us focus on the pragmatic. Let us focus on getting on with the work of government. After all, is that not what our constituents would expect of us?
Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to speak in this debate and follow the honourable member from Stirling. And at 1 minute past midnight this morning, we've seen a tweet from the member for Glasgow North, the SNP Chief Whip, no doubt still up late celebrating England's win in the World Cup, no doubt, saying, breaking news, this is the very first debate we'll have in Parliament on the claim of right, obviously forgetting that he had a debate in his very name back on the 9th of September back in 2016 on the claim of right in Westminster Hall. And the reason that was so remarkable is because I agree with many colleagues across this House that I would rather be speaking here this evening on issues that are relevant to my constituents and my constituency. We've got the dilution of local policing across Scotland, which is showing a crime spree of housebreaking and car breaking in my own constituency. We've got a GP crisis in my own constituency where people can't sign up to GPs, they're on waiting lists, they're being kicked out of surgeries. We've got people waiting up to 2 years for operations when they used to only wait 12 weeks for operations. We've got a train service that's in meltdown. We've got an economy that the Secretary of State was right to say is sluggish. And we've still, after all of these debates that we've had since 2016 and everything in between, no answers to the big questions about what an independent Scotland would look like. We've had a Growth Commission paper that is bigger an act of fiction as the original White Paper was. And I agree with the claim of right, and the Shadow Secretary of State was absolutely right. It was Labour that invented this process back in the late 1980s. It was Labour that drove this process back in the late 1980s, and the late, great Jimmy Hood, if he was still alive today, would be championing in this chamber tonight about bringing back the Scottish Constitutional Convention so we could resolve some of these issues. Wouldn't that be a bundle of fun with 50-odd Scottish MPs on that particular body. Now, the claim of right says, we gather as the Scottish Constitutional Convention to hereby acknowledge the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine its own form of government. The Scottish people have determined their own form of government. They determined in 1997 to vote for a Labour government that promised to bring the referendum on a Scottish Parliament. They voted overwhelmingly to deliver that Scottish Parliament with tax-raising powers in that yes vote. They therefore, in the ballot box since then, have delivered their sovereign will of what they want achieved in terms of the governments and what they want to happen. But interestingly, they also do this at the ballot box for local government elections as well, and lots of other elections. And why I get so frustrated about these kinds of debates is because it's a sovereign will for the Scottish people, for the Scottish National Party, but only when it suits. The sovereign will of the Scottish people was to deliver a Scottish Parliament, was to stay in the United Kingdom. But also, it was the sovereign will of the Scottish people to deliver a Scottish Parliament where the Scottish National Party did not have a majority. And that Scottish Parliament, if it's the sovereign will of the Scottish people, has over the last few years voted against the government on fracking, on cuts to the National Health Service, on Highlands and Islands Enterprise, on council funding, on the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act and threatening behaviour, on failing educational standards and local government cuts. And what have the sovereign will of the Scottish people received in return? Nothing from the Scottish Parliament. Disregard the Scottish parliamentary votes. These didn't happen. Turn the other way. Don't implement the will of the Scottish Parliament, which is the will of the Scottish people. And let me also say why it's frustrating, because it's only sovereign will of the Scottish people when it suits. Look at local government. We have local government completely and utterly diminished, demoralised and demolished by significant cuts from the Scottish Government, who've passed on 9 or 10% grant cuts from this place and doubled and trebled them for local government. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful for him giving way. Does he also agree that the 11 years of the SNP government of Edinburgh has created a highly centralised state? The power grab that's gone on in Scotland is a grab to the centre by the SNP government.
Well, I'm glad about that intervention, because it goes to the point, and people can start shouting better together, but I'm going to stand up for the people of Scotland in my constituency, because I do disagree fundamentally from the leader of the SNP during his speech. He does not speak for the people of Scotland, and you are entitled to have a different viewpoint, although we don't share that particular viewpoint. And you're right, because this chamber, when the Scotland Act of 2016 was given third reading and royal assent, delivered one of the most powerful Scottish parliaments, most powerful parliaments in the world, but it's the most centralist parliament in the world. Local government no longer exists in Scotland. It is merely an administrative arm of the Scottish government. And look at what we've seen today. We have a leader, an SNP leader of the City of Edinburgh Council, that wants to deliver a tourist tax, and be given the powers to deliver a tourist tax in Edinburgh that would help hard-pressed council ratepayers, Edinburgh Council ratepayers, with all the issues that they are currently going through. And the Cabinet Secretary slaps him down on Twitter and essentially says no. Where's the sovereign will of the Edinburgh people who put Adam McVeigh's leader of the council in under the STV system? I don't want an SNP majority-led Edinburgh Council. I want a Labour majority-led or a Labour council majority in a coalition. But that's what the people delivered. That is the sovereign will of the people who went into the ballot box. And I think we have to reflect, and I say this very publicly, that's exactly what happened in Aberdeen, when Aberdeen voters went to the ballot box and delivered the numbers that they delivered in Aberdeen to give us what we've got. So it is an incredibly centralist government, and that's why the sovereign will of the Scottish people is only when it suits. And I just go to the sovereign will of the Scottish people in terms of what it's actually delivering. And this is again where it only suits the SNP when it suits their case. The SNP refused to back a people's vote on a referendum on the final deal from the European Union. Now, there will be lots of different views across this chamber. In fact, there's lots of different views in the chamber on my side of the House already in terms of whether there's a people's vote. But the principle is this, simply for me. If you believe in the sovereign will of the Scottish people, why not back an additional vote for the Scottish people and the people across the UK to decide on the final deal that the UK government brings back in terms of the Brexit deal, and then let the sovereign will of the Scottish people decide? No. The SNP reluctantly fudge it and say maybe we would back it, maybe we won't, but only if independence is on the table as part of it. It's only the sovereign will of the Scottish people when it suits. So I simply say, in terms of the sovereign will of the Scottish people, and in terms of the convention, it is written down, it is being delivered, it has been delivered, and everything that will be delivered in the future in terms of the Scottish will, the sovereign will of the Scottish people, will happen at the ballot box when the people of Scotland go to vote, and that's exactly what they've done. And before the SNP start jumping up and down and say, what about the Brexit referendum? Well, look, the rules of the game are as follows. There is a UK-wide referendum. People voted to leave. The rules of the game are we're part of the United Kingdom. I hope we don't leave. I always say, if we leave the European Union, I'll do everything in my power to try and stop it. And if I can't stop it, I'll do everything in my power to try and soften it. But we are where you are. We can't pick and choose votes when it suits us to pick and choose. And very quickly,
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's making a very strong point about the EU referendum. Doesn't he recognise that it was done on a total number of votes across the United Kingdom, not on a geographical basis? So perhaps if the SNP had joined Stronger In and actually gone out and proactively campaigned for Remain, we could have got those few extra votes and kept us in there, not as part of Stronger In.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to dance to the honourable gentleman's tune, because in actual fact, just as big a threat to the United Kingdom is the Conservative Party's attitude towards Scotland at the moment. The Conservative Party pushing through a referendum on Brexit with the former Prime Minister betting everything on winning that referendum and losing. So actually, as big a threat to the Union at the moment is the attitude of the Scottish Conservatives by pushing through a hard Brexit as lobby fodder for the Prime Minister rather than fighting for the interests of his own constituents. So I'm happy for him to gesticulate and say keep attacking the SNP, but actually the government benches are just as bad in terms of the sovereign will of the way that people have voted, because we were promised that Ruth Davidson would send Scottish Conservative MPs down to this chamber to fight for the interests of Scotland, and not one time have any of those Scottish Conservative MPs taken a different view from the Chief Whip and the Prime Minister. So when Brexit does happen and Brexit goes badly, you 12 will own it as much as the Prime Minister will own it. Sorry, the honourable gentleman will own it, because the Madam Deputy Speaker will not own Brexit, because it will be owned primarily by the Scottish Conservatives. And I finish on this in terms of this theme about the sovereign will of the Scottish people when it suits. Because the SNP, as we've already discussed, didn't participate in this process. They had no intention of ever participating in this process, regardless of the warm words that we hear now. But now they grab on to this claim of right and the sovereign will of the Scottish people because it suits them to do so. I would suggest very politely that the UK Government and the Scottish Government try and find a way to desperately get round the table to improve the relations between two governments, so that we can have two governments at least trying to work in the interests of Scotland. Because whilst we've got a flag-waving ceremony between the Conservative Party and the Scottish National Party, it's my constituents that lose out.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll try and keep my points succinct tonight. I think we lose the whole point of this place in some of these debates. It's been said by many members across the House that actually we should be talking about the material issues, perhaps like expenditure in Scotland, which was debated last night, where only 2 SNP MPs turned up. Yeah. Perhaps we should be discussing fishing, as other members have said, but we're not. We're back to the same old broken record from the Scottish Nationalist Party. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, what's really important is actually the original purpose of this Parliament. The unity that appears in the United Kingdom that started with the vision of a Scottish king, that was then led through in an act of union that abolished both the English and Scottish parliaments to make this place, to make a United Kingdom Parliament where it would have members from across the entire country to work together, to pool their resources together, to make laws together that could benefit right across the United Kingdom. Now, as the hundreds of years have passed by, we've adapted. We've seen that more powers need to be devolved. The power needs to get closer to the people who actually are using the services, who are having a day-to-day experience with the public goods that are being provided. But I think it's disingenuous for members opposite to say that somehow Scotland's voice isn't heard here. It's heard through their voices. It's heard through Conservative member voices, Liberal Democrats and Labour members. Yeah. It is heard right around this House because this Parliament is Scotland's Parliament as much as Holyrood is. And that needs to be recognised. And people and my constituents need to stop being bullied by the SNP and pushed to make a choice between being Scottish or British. They can be proud of both and they can have confidence in both of their parliaments to deliver their public services. And what I won't take, Madam Deputy Speaker, are lectures from the other side who talk about centralisation or ignoring the will of the people. Madam Deputy Speaker, if you want to have a model diagram of how to do that, look at the centralisation that takes part in Edinburgh, how powers have been stripped away from our local councils, powers and monies. We now have record budget deficits in spite of underspends in the central Scottish budget. So that means music tuition is cut in my constituency. It means the health boards are stretching in my constituency. It means public services are being suffering right across my constituency. And that's not because of Westminster, that is because of the Scottish Nationalist Party. And Madam Deputy Speaker, they should change the name. They're not the Scottish Nationalist Party, they are the selfish Nationalist Party. All they are concerned about, they have one reason for existence, and that is separation, that is division. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are the Conservative and Unionist Party. We have delivered on devolution, as we've always promised. We have stood up in this chamber, and actually we've challenged our own government ministers, as well as other members in this House, on issues like the EU, to make sure we get the right deal when it comes to EU citizens on the economic trade deal. And again, we'll see how that comes out in October. When we talk about devolution, we've got to look at virtually every single policy area that has been devolved. 20 years of devolution, 11 years of SNP management, and yet we see pretty much every core area is underperforming. In education, we've gone from first to third in the United Kingdom, and yet schools are still now cascading through international rankings. When you're looking at health, even after 20 years of devolution, we still have the lowest life expectancy of any part of the United Kingdom. I will give way.
Does the honourable gentleman accept the verdict of the BBC that Scotland under an SNP government has the best performing NHS in the United Kingdom?
No, because it's still facing the problems.
6 of its 7 targets.
Exactly. 6 of 7 targets, mental health targets is missing. Say that to the consultants, say that to the constituents that have come to me, because they can't get certain surgeries in Scotland, but they can in England. This isn't about just saying, oh, wow, England's worse than us, so we must be amazing. There are challenges right across the United Kingdom, and that is the point of this place, is that we pull together when there are common challenges, but then we also deliver locally when we need to as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, a lot is said about respect tonight. It's always saying about respect for the Scottish people, and yet what I can't understand is members opposite don't respect this Parliament. They certainly don't respect my constituents, and I have to say I don't think they respect themselves. The conduct of the last few weeks, walking out through Prime Minister's questions, deliberately agitating in this chamber, and some of the incidents, and it may well be on both sides of the House, and that should be condemned on both sides if it is, but the incidents that are taking place, it doesn't do credit to any honourable members across this House, but it is being led by the Scottish National Party. And if as the honourable members have stated opposite, not just now, thank you, if the honourable members were genuine about their love for Scotland, about their care for Scotland, they wouldn't be agitating for a second independence referendum now, when Brexit isn't even decided. If they really cared about Scotland, they would wait until the deal is done. They would wait until we were very clear about the situation we've got and what the government had actually achieved for the United Kingdom, and then take a cold, hard look at the analysis and say, actually, are we better off in the United Kingdom or breaking out of the United Kingdom and splitting off to be a separate country? Yes, I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I'm listening to this debate as a fellow Celt representing an English seat. My honourable friend has mentioned the word respect. I intervene on his speech, it could be on anybody's. We see rampant nationalism and nastiness all over Europe and elsewhere. No. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the best advert for this place and for democracy is for all of us, irrespective of differences, to show respect and regard to each other, which always seems to be missing, unfortunately, over the last few months in any debates to do with anything to do with Scotland?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he's quite right, and he makes a very valid point from another part of this United Kingdom, because, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just Scotland that's watching this evening, but it's also over 800,000 Scots that reside in other parts of the United Kingdom that are watching also, as well as English, Welsh, Northern Irish, and however many different nationalities reside in the United Kingdom, because for any British citizen, this is their Parliament. They are the ones that elect us, and they are the ones that pay our wages. So I think respect needs to be given right across the United Kingdom to our individual constituents by both parties, but also to the rest of the United Kingdom as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's been talk of hope, saying what exactly could we be? If Scotland was free of this horrific United Kingdom, then we would be able to achieve so much more without it. But I would remind honourable members that actually it's this place that delivers on hope. It's this place that established the National Health Service. The National Health Service now that honourable members opposite actually stand up now and try and criticise or indeed champion. It was set up in this chamber. I'm talking about this chamber. I'm talking the debate about whether things happen or not, but it's the output that matters. We established the NHS in this chamber. We established the welfare state in this chamber. And as we heard from one of our ministers, Secretary of State today, indeed we are delivering international aid through pooling our resources together, Scots, English, Welsh, Northern Irish and everyone else delivering for other countries all around the world. And it's all through this chamber. So I will no longer sit here and listen to SNP members do down the United Kingdom, do down Scotland's Parliament and say that we don't have a place in it. We do, we're here, and so are you. And so are the opposition. And we're here to represent our constituents and make sure we pull together and contribute. Yes, I will give way.
Come for giving way. He does realise that the reason that legislation is talking about was voted in the 1940s here was because there wasn't a Scottish Parliament. There wasn't a Scottish Parliament because the Conservatives consistently voted against Home Rule.
Maybe I need to go back to the history lesson that I gave at the beginning of the speech. There wasn't a Scottish Parliament because a Scottish king decided to unify the crowns to make one United Kingdom, and then an act of union, a voluntary act of union, abolished both Scottish and English parliaments and made this place. That is the historical fact. We are a unitary state where the Westminster, in our current constitution, Westminster is the sovereign parliament of the United Kingdom. That is why we have directly elected members to this parliament, and that is why there are such hotly contested debates around the time of a general election in Scotland, because people know how important it is. They know that they're sending members to Westminster. They know the influence they will have. They know the difference that they can make. So don't do down my constituents and the energy they put into voting in a general election, because we matter, the Scottish Parliament matters, and so do our local authorities matter as well. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would just finish on this. We're looking at the 21st century world. We're racked with challenges from climate change to different technological investments to also looking at international fracture from different countries all around the world. Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if somehow we could look to a place that would bring neighbours together, that would enable us to pool our resources together, to decide how to advance our NHS, how to advance our welfare, to make sure we get 20 billion extra for the NHS, to make sure we forward the cause of science and international diplomacy and international aid? Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have it. It's this Parliament, it's this United Kingdom, and that's what we've been sent here to represent, and that was what we will continue to fight for on this side of the House.
Yeah. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the principal creation of this political state in 1707, not through the Union of Crowns in, I believe, the 1603, between the nation of Scotland and England, and, of course, its subsequent expansion through the Acts of Union of 1800 with the nation of Ireland, and subsequent changes through the Articles of Agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland, signed on the 6th of December in 1921, as well as the creation of the three devolved administrations, Wales, Northern Ireland and, of course, Scotland. There can be no doubt, and I think there is agreement, that the political structure of these islands and the political relationship between this present political state and, yes, even through the Good Friday Agreement with the Irish state, is a fluid and ever-changing story. Therefore, it should come as no surprise, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this debate should be brought to the floor of the House tonight. Indeed, the premise of the sovereign rights of the Scottish nation, founded in its citizens, is an agreed reality, given that this House itself recognised the position through the right of the Scottish nation to participate in the referendum of 2014. The former Right Honourable Member, actually, for Finchley, went even further. In their memoirs, The Downing Street Years, the former Premier, who I never thought I would quote, was clear. The members opposite should listen. If, and that is the Tory party, sometimes seems English to some Scots, that is because the Union is inevitably dominated by England, by reason of its greater population. The Scots, being in a historic nation, not my words, with a proud past, will inevitably resent some expressions of this fact from time to time.
No.
As a nation, they have an undoubted right to national self-determination. Thus far, they have exercised that right by joining and remaining, and in my words, even in 2014, remaining in the Union. But back to the Right Honourable Member for Finchley again. Should they determine on independence, as no English party or politician would stand in their way, however much we might regret their departure. There will be many in this chamber, including myself, uncomfortable at giving a quote from the former Right Honourable Member for Finchley, and I think that's on all sides. Yet the Baroness's quote, the late Baroness, this quote illustrates the reality of the constitutional position of this existing political state. The reality of the claim, the claim of right, and I must say written in 1988, is another example of the expression of that self-evident truth, acknowledging as it does, the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. It is a principle well versed and affirmed in ancient right that neither monarch or parliament, not one individual or a select collective, has dominion over the people. That is the nation, and that is Scotland. Now, more than ever, Madam Deputy Speaker, the importance of at least Scottish constituency MPs, and I would be grateful if there is a division this evening to see members from across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, that reaffirming that long-held ancient principle is critical, given that the nation of Scotland, majority, and I must say my own constituency included, one which also voted for the liberation and regaining of the sovereignty of the nation of Scotland, it has now been dragged out of the family of European nations. But just some critical facts in terms of centralisation, in terms of Scotland. It should also, in terms of historical narrative, be reminded to members in this House, for those who have not been in local government in Scotland, that in the last reform of local government in Scotland was, of course, led by the present government of the United Kingdom, in which it rearranged the local governance of Scotland. And it is since its premise, since it became, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government of Scotland through the devolved settlement, the present Scottish Government, which set out the Concordat and existing relationships with local government, supported the length and breadth of Scottish local government through COSLA. And for those members who don't know what COSLA means, it is the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. But I'm not going to take up more time, Madam Deputy Speaker, but on this basic principle. This place, no matter how much members love it, should never seek to limit those constitutional realities, whether we agree with them or not. And that this place must clearly understand that no matter what is said or done, Scotland is, today and forever, a nation, a distinct, proud, historic nation, free, and able to direct its governance and destiny.
Jamie Stone.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have enjoyed the debate this evening very much indeed, and particularly the scholarly dissertation given by the Honourable Member for West Dunbartonshire. The subject tonight is there above us, the claim of right for Scotland. And let me put it on the record right away that I stand full square with that claim of right. And I may be many things, but perhaps pride is a sin, one of the 7 deadly sins, they say. I take pride in my involvement in Scottish affairs over the years. I'm one of 6 members in this place who also served in Holyrood. I had the honour to represent Keith Sutherland and Easter Ross for 12 years in Holyrood. And it was the making of my life, and I look back upon those days with pleasure and as something I can tell my children and my grandchildren in the years to come. I hate to say pride, but I'm proud of it. Now, let me use this example. In my garden, I have a big piece of Kemney granite, and that is one of the stones that the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood is built out of. And when the building was complete, the builders very kindly gave me one leftover piece of Kemney granite, and that stands in my garden. I was involved in building the physical structure of the Scottish Parliament, as the Secretary of State himself will recall. And myself and Linda Fabiani, who is now Deputy Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament, and John Hume Robertson, who once graced the Labour benches in this place, it was not an easy task. We had the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune coming at us all the time. It made good friends of us. But again, I take pride in the fact that this building is our Parliament in Scotland. And I think they do also. I served in my time on the Scottish Constitutional Convention, which has been made of already this evening. I represent Ross and Cromwell District Council as one of the local authority reps on the convention. I was in my day, believe it or not, when you look at the aged frame before you, I was the youngest member from the Highlands and a callow youth, but nevertheless, I feel I made my contribution. Now, against this background, Madam Speaker, I want to turn again to the subject before us, which is, of course, is the claim of right. Now, while I have enjoyed the contributions from the benches in front of me very greatly, I cannot help but pose the question, why is the claim of right being used as the peg to hang the hat on today? Because that does give me some trouble. Not more recently in the debate, but early in the debate, mention was made of the fact that the Scottish National Party would not sign up to the Scottish Constitutional Convention. And, in fairness to these members in front of me, they have given their reasons for that. It was because it didn't include the independence option. And I accept that argument. But nevertheless, as somebody who worked hard on the Scottish Constitutional Convention, and also we had to go through difficult times to get the scheme of the Scottish Parliament together, I regret very greatly that the Scottish National Party did not take part. And I have to remind members of this chamber that there were times when the former member of this place, Mr Alex Salmond, was not unknown to make disparaging comments about the work of the Scottish Constitutional Convention, and I regret that also. So, leading on from that, it's an inevitable, logical follow-on. The SNP did not sign the Claim of Right. Now, to me, the Claim of Right is one of the most important documents in recent Scottish history. And what the Chamber will not know, but I now say, is that I've talked about my pride, but the greatest pride I take is in the fact that my name is on that Claim of Right. Yeah. No other member of this place can say that, and I do, and I'm not going to give away my pride in that fact for anything whatsoever. Therefore, let me say this. To my mind, the fact that the Claim of Right, a document with which I'm associated, in which I take great pride, and the people of Scotland do, I am saddened that it's being used for the purposes of this debate. And I say with respect to the Right Honourable Member for Ross Carnlough Harbour, I'm afraid it demeans him and it cheapens the tone of the debate, and I wish it were not so. And I leave my contribution at that. Thank you.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's quite useful to follow the Honourable Member for Caithness, and I congratulate him on the distinction that he has of being one of the few signatories to the Claim of Right that is still here, because just think of the scene. The economy on the brink of recession, the government hopelessly divided over Europe, the Labour Party in turmoil, a woman Prime Minister in Downing Street, Scotland living under yet another Conservative government that it didn't vote for, pushing through damaging social policies against the will of the vast majority of people and Scottish parliamentarians. And that was the situation in 1989, when the Claim of Right was first signed, and the snowball that led to the Scottish Parliament of devolution, the snowball of devolution that led to the Scottish Parliament, began to gather speed. But the more things change, the more things, it seems, stay the same, except that Scotland has changed and the United Kingdom has changed. Now, my right honourable friend from Ross Skye and Lochaber made the point that many others have done, that for those 15 hours when polls were open on the 19th and the 18th of September 2014, Scotland truly was exercising its sovereignty as a true and free independent country. The future of our governance was in our hands and nobody else's. And that's why we would have been happy to accept the amendment had it been accepted by or selected by the Chair, because a decision was made, and we on these benches, of course, were disappointed. But Scotland had voted to remain in the Union. But voters were repeatedly told during the 2014 referendum that a vote no was not a vote for the status quo, and that choosing to stay in the Union would bring about a new relationship in which Scotland would lead the UK, not leave the UK. A vow was made to deliver something as near to federalism as possible, and a guarantee was given that Scotland would remain a member of the European Union. And nearly 4 years from that independence referendum, none of those promises have been kept. So there may have been a new status quo on the morning of the 19th of September 2014, but there was also a new status quo on the morning of the 24th of June 2016, when the United Kingdom that people in Scotland voted for ceased to exist. People in Scotland in 2014 voted for a United Kingdom that would be and would remain a member of the European Union, a United Kingdom that would guarantee people in Scotland freedom of movement for themselves and their goods, for their capital and their services across the continent. We were told by no less than Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives herself, that the way for Scotland to stay in the European Union was to vote no in 2014, and that has been ripped like a rug from out of under the feet of the people of Scotland. And that is why there has been a material change in circumstances, and that is why it is right that this House now comes to recognise the sovereign right of the people of Scotland. I give way to the member from Stirling.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I was struck by the sincerity and passion of the speech of the Honourable Gentleman. He did say that he wondered why the claim of right was being discussed tonight, why it was being used as a peg to hang a hat on. And I wonder whether the Honourable Gentleman, who is a figure of authority in the parliamentary party of the SNP, would confirm it is not the intention of the Scottish National Party and government in Scotland to move our country to an illegal referendum. That this is not an excuse that the SNP is looking to create the pretext to have an illegal referendum.
The fact is that the Scottish Parliament was re-elected in 2016, a new Scottish Government was formed with a mandate that if there was a material change in circumstances, it reserved the right to request an independence referendum. That request was made. A request for a Section 30 order was agreed by a majority of members of the Scottish Parliament. That request is extant. It's still there. The First Minister has said it's been put on pause as a result of the 2017 UK general election, but the result of the 2017 UK general election was to return a majority of members from Scotland who support independence and who, at the very least, support the right of the people of Scotland to choose. But something very interesting has happened in this debate. Something very interesting has happened in this debate, because the Secretary of State for Scotland and his honourable friends have said with a kind of shrug of the shoulders, oh, well, of course we accept this motion, as if this isn't really that big a deal. In 2012, Ruth Davidson and her Scottish Conservative colleagues in the Scottish Parliament were the only party to actively vote against the claim of right for Scotland when it was put to the Scottish Parliament. So although we hear from Liberal Democrat colleagues that the SNP didn't sign it in 1989 for reasons that are well rehearsed, it was endorsed by Scotland's Parliament in 2012, and the Scottish Conservatives actively refused to sign it at that point. So if the Secretary of State will now tell me what has changed and why they are now prepared to assent to that, I'll be very happy to take an intervention.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what I am going to set out to the House is just the evidence that it's always grievance. It was all... The grievance now is that we're supporting their motion. If we hadn't been supporting the motion, that would have been the grievance. This isn't about the claim of right, it's about building grievance so that they can build their case for independence.
And we'll no doubt hear, because of course the Government has committed in 30 days, if an opposition motion is carried, to produce a statement, so we'll no doubt hear that it's not binding and this and that and all the next thing. But it can't change. The Government can decide whether or not it wants to accept it, but the House is accepting. This House, this sovereign Parliament, is actually, if what the Secretary of State and his honourable friends are saying is correct, are going to accept the principle of the sovereignty of the people of Scotland. And I'm surprised that some of the Brexiteers who want to take back control, the honourable members for the 18th and 19th century, haven't actually come along this evening to defend their cherished and beloved parliamentary sovereignty. But perhaps it's because they actually can't, because as we've seen through the European Withdrawal Bill process, it's not this House that is taking back control. It's the executive that's taking back control. The power grab is not simply the power grab from the Scottish Parliament. It's the power grab from this House, with the statutory instruments and the delegated authority and the ministerial fiat that has been, and diktat that has been grabbed and taken by the content of the European Withdrawal Bill. That is the real power grab that is going on, and that is the undermining not just of the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, but in fact the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament as they have traditionally seen it. But we have to remember, at the end of the day, we've heard from all of these different members about why hasn't the SNP brought this or that or the next thing. Well, in actual fact, we do on a day and daily basis talk about the issues that affect the members, that affect our constituents and the people of Scotland. And when they talk about the estimates debate that was heard yesterday, I would say to the Shadow Secretary of State, there was no Labour member from Scotland taking part in that debate at all, and that was a debate on the devolution spend and the Barnett consequentials. So I would simply say I was proud, as the member for Edinburgh from the Labour Party that spoke, I was proud to lead a debate on the claim of right in Westminster Hall. But that was a debate on that this House has considered. What we have today is an actionable, votable motion, and the Government has indicated for the first time that it's prepared to accept it.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He's making a very powerful speech. Is it not the case, if the Government accepts this motion tonight, then they're accepting the principle of the sovereignty of the Scottish people? If that follows, and if the Scottish Government has a majority and a mandate to ask for a referendum on a change of circumstances, is it not the case that the Conservative opposite are duty-bound to follow that and make sure that the Government pushes through a Section 38 licence?
Precisely. I think the Minister will have a chance to respond and sum up at the end of the debate. But I think this is why the Government has to.
Point of order, Leslie Laird.
The honourable member suggested that there was no member of the Labour Party at the estimates debate and did not speak. As the honourable gentleman will of course know, I was sitting on the front bench and I'm unable to intervene in that debate in that way.
Well, the honourable lady has put that on the record, and I'm sure everyone in here will accept it. Patrick Grady.
Yes, that's a very helpful statement of fact. It doesn't change the reality of the situation that nobody spoke from the Scottish Labour benches. Anyway, I would simply say that we in this House, and it's some of the sort of partisanship that has been shown, it's not ideal, because we make no special claim to the claim.
Point of order, Hugh Gaffney.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I would like to also, for the record, point out that I did speak in that debate. I made an intervention yesterday in that debate.
The point of order should be addressed to me. I will respond. Again, the honourable gentleman has put what happened on the record, has made it very clear. But I would also say the debate is coming to a close. There are other people who want to speak, so I would urge people just not to have endless points of order. Patrick Grady.
Yes, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I mean, they come here and they complain that we want to talk about process and we're obsessed with individual constitutional issues, and then this is what we get. When the Scottish Parliament debated and adopted the claim of right in 2012, it didn't, and it wasn't being asked to endorse the principle of independence, but it was asked to acknowledge the principle of deciding on independence. And so the claim of right is not just an historical document or a scholarly debating point or an obscure document, as the member from Stirling said. It is a fundamental principle on which our democracy rests. And the UK Government, in accepting this tonight, are making a very serious and quite important point about maintaining the Union as a partnership of equals, and they need to understand that. We should, and this Tory Government in particular, perhaps in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, should reflect on the famous words of the convener of the Scottish Constitutional Convention, Canon Kenyon Wright, who said at the opening of the Convention, "What if that other voice that we all know so well responds by saying, 'We say no, and we are the state. Well, we say yes, and we are the people.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to now impose a six-minute time limit. Patricia Gibson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I am delighted to speak in this debate today on the claim of right for Scotland, asserting as it does the sovereignty of the Scottish people, declaring the right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government that best suits their needs. And this is indeed a timely debate. I know some people in the chamber have questioned why we're debating this. This debate could not be more timely, because we need to do all we can to ensure the wishes of the people of Scotland are respected. 20 years into devolution, the Scottish Parliament's powers are under threat, with a power grab by the party which fought tooth and nail against the very establishment of that Parliament and has never fully got behind it or truly believed in it. I'm not going to talk tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, about independence, because the Tories and the Labour Party have talked about nothing else, and they accuse us of being obsessed. And I would remind them, when they talk about independence, as they incessantly do, that in 2016 the SNP government have a mandate to hold a referendum given the material change in circumstances. So perhaps, if they're so concerned about the will of the people, they should reflect on that. We had a referendum in Scotland on EU membership, for which there is no evidence that the people of Scotland wanted. We in Scotland voted to remain in the EU by a very convincing majority, and now we are being removed against our will from a family of nations of which we wish to remain part. Now, we were told tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, by the benches opposite, that what we really should be doing is waiting to see how Brexit unfolds. Well, let's look at how Brexit is unfolding. The Chancellor disagrees with the Foreign Secretary. The Foreign Secretary disagrees with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister disagrees with the Secretary of State for the Environment. The Secretary of State for International Trade has his head stuck firmly in the sand and says it's all going well. And there's nothing to see here, so just move along. And the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union doesn't seem to know how the final deal on Brexit will be. And this is even before we get to this week's antics in which the honourable gentleman opposite was involved. If anyone thinks that we should wait to see how Brexit is unfolding, I think we should buy some popcorn, if it were not so serious. We've heard the Secretary of State for Scotland tonight unable or perhaps unwilling to explain why the claim of right is now to be supported by the Tories but could not be supported in 2012. With the passing of the EU Withdrawal Bill in the teeth of opposition from the democratically elected Scottish Parliament, a withholding of consent for that bill from every political party save the out-of-touch Tories, the contempt for Scotland, for her people and for her democratic institutions is as clear as it can be. So let's talk about the claim of right. The consent for Clause 15 of the Withdrawal Bill in Holyrood was withheld by a huge majority of 93 votes to 30. And as a consequence, as we know, Madam Deputy Speaker, it should not have passed through this House with that clause intact. In the event, it did remain intact, with a mere 19 minutes of debate time allocated, with not one Scottish MP able or permitted to speak. And then you ask tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, they ask tonight why we are debating the claim of right. They should be ashamed of themselves. When you ignore the entire concept of consent, when you ride roughshod over democratic institutions elected by the people of Scotland, and remember, the Tories have not won an election in Scotland for 55 years. When you ride roughshod over the Scottish people and their will, you do so at your peril. We have heard tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the affection, the esteem in which the Scottish Parliament is held. Westminster enjoys no such reputation in Scotland. And we have repeatedly heard the powers being clawed back by this government. We've repeatedly heard them being diminished. The members opposite know exactly how important these powers are. Agriculture, fisheries, food labelling, public procurement, and I remind the members opposite, the public are watching. Public procurement.
You've allowed it to happen.
Public procurement, Madam Deputy Speaker, could constitute an attack
on our public services, and I have listened to MPs in the Tory ranks rubbishing these concerns. Well, your constituents will have something to say about that. I know it's very inconvenient, Madam Deputy Speaker, for those who oppose the very concept of devolution, who want to deny the very nationhood of Scotland. And they wish us pesky Scots would stop using our voices to decry the injustices and acts of contempt being perpetrated on Scotland. But we will not go quietly. Tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, we reassert the claim of right for Scotland without apology, despite all the blistering attacks from the benches opposite. Scotland is watching, and I say to the members opposite, you are swimming against the tide of history, and you will soon find yourself engulfed in the waves.
Martin Whitford.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to discuss and contribute to this debate. The concept of the claim of right dates back, of course, to the Claim of Rights Act in 1689 and refers then to the right of appeal to the sovereign and the monarch against perceived judicial injustice. The 1689 Act gave access to the then Parliament of Scotland, where the monarch in Parliament sat. The Act of Union led to the abolition of the Parliament of Scotland, and the right then transferred to the House of Lords, now, of course, the United Kingdom Supreme Court. And the concept of that right was taken by the Scottish Constitutional Convention in 1989 to grant the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. An idea itself which dates back to the thinking of my predecessor, J.P. Mackintosh, an honourable member of this House, who died far too young 40 years ago this month. The claim of right draws on the principle of empowering communities, and it is only a criticism of governments that they appear far too happy to accept new powers, but are very reluctant to pass them on downwards to their communities, to the local authorities and even lower. The claim of right has developed into the devolution debate that we've heard today. And again, my predecessor, J.P. Mackintosh, shared with his great friend, Donald Dewar, a passionate commitment to the cause of Scottish devolution. And as Donald Dewar said, articulating Mackintosh's view, at its core, it is about democratic control. It is the empowering of people. It is not for the nationalistic glorification of a nation-state. It was never Scotland right or wrong, but about good government, about an equitable democracy that borrows, elevates and creates opportunities for the citizen. The idea of the Union State made stronger by the diversity of its communities, the constituent parts, rather than a creeping uniformity. The shouts of conform, conform, put it all in a meat mincer so it all looks the same, should be battled against. I will very...
Thank my honourable friend for giving way on that very important point that he's making. Is it not the reality in practice that this Parliament, far from being at odds with the principles of the claim of right, has actually energised and activated the claim of right by repeatedly, in practice, devolving powers down through numerous examples through the last 50 years, from the European Economic Area through to the devolution amendments, devolution referendums of the last few years?
I'm grateful for that intervention. It's right to say that power's gone down, but too often powers stick in one place instead of being handed down, and we look at the crisis in our local authorities in Scotland, where they've had powers taken back into the centralised government. And we stand here today between a party whose sole aim is a nationalistic independence, flag-waving, shouting, and a party who, with all respect, fail to see the true potential of devolution, the goal of a stronger, kinder union, a fairer union, that our communities have a stake in, not just in the results of a decision, but also in that decision-making power. We live at a time of world challenges, a choice made to stand differently to Europe, a decision that saddens me, but one I respect. But we must still stand as part of a Europe. The claim of right underpins not a set type of governance. It is a reality that the form of governance should be influenced by, borrowed from, elevate and create the opportunities of the citizens that sign up to it. And as J.P. Mackintosh said, and it stands in testament to the fluid ideas that underpin the demands of a citizen, it is not beyond the wit of man to devise institutions to meet those demands. I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier on in this debate, I intervened on the Secretary of State for Scotland to ask him whether he supported the principle of self-determination in Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations, and I was very pleased that he said that he did. And for those who need reminding, what Article 1 says is that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. Now, of course, the reason why we've brought this motion today is because of what has occurred since the people of Scotland last voted in relation to their self-determination in 2014, the Brexit vote. Because, of course, the implications of Brexit for Scotland's economic, social and cultural development are enormous. And that's why we wish to reassert today the right of the Scottish people to self-determination. But it's been very pleasing, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there have been a number of very significant concessions from other parties during the course of this debate. The Honourable Member for Murray has said that he accepts the sovereignty of the Scottish people. I'm sure that may come as a surprise to some of his colleagues who aren't here this evening from English constituencies who so often tell us that it is this Parliament and this Parliament alone that is sovereign. But he's made that concession. I'll take an intervention in a moment. So that's one concession from the benches opposite. The Honourable Member from Stirling has said that he will vote for this motion tonight, and I was delighted to hear that as well, and I'm very much hoping that all of his colleagues will go through the lobbies to vote for the motion, because again I say the support for this principle will become very important when the First Minister of Scotland once again approaches the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom looking for a Section 30 order. Because, of course, the Honourable Member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, who speaks for the official opposition, also made a very important concession. If I heard her correctly, I think she said that if there was a mandate for another independence referendum in Scotland, she would support that. Well, that's very good. That's music to my ears, Madam Deputy Speaker, because there is a mandate already for another independence in Scotland. It comes from the democratically elected Scottish Parliament, which, in the light of the Brexit vote, voted to give, with the SNP and the Greens together, voted to give the First Minister of Scotland a mandate to request from... let me finish my point, please. A mandate to request from this government a Section 30 order in order to hold another independence referendum. So if members opposite and members on the Labour opposition benches haven't twigged already, then let me spell it out for them. That is what this motion is about tonight. It is about protecting the right of the Scottish people to take necessary steps to protect themselves from the consequences of Brexit. Because you see, Madam Deputy Speaker, unlike the people's vote, the vote for a second independence referendum in Scotland already has a mandate. That's a distinction which the Honourable Gentleman for Edinburgh South and the Lib Dems who are no longer in their place do not seem to understand. Now, before I go any further, I want to take the opportunity to defend my right honourable friend and our group leader, the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Loch Aber. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, there has been a concerted attempt by the benches opposite this evening to attempt to assassinate his character by putting into the Hansard record allegations about him which cannot be upheld. I note, Madam Deputy Speaker, that neither you nor anyone else in the chair this evening has ruled his conduct disorderly. In speaking up passionately for the viewpoint of the Scottish National Party, he is simply exercising his mandate and doing his job. And in so doing, he has our support, the support of his constituents and the support of the Scottish National Party. Now, I'll take some intervention.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. She mentioned what those of us on this side had said and had put into Hansard. Will she accept that what I said about the Right Honourable Gentleman was he made it all far too personal? He was playing the man rather than the ball. Yes. And if they really want to have a constitutional debate where they want to engage people from all sides, they have to stop these petty attacks on individuals.
Yes, I did hear the Honourable Gentleman for Murray say that. But I don't accept that he was right, and can I suggest that he gets a mirror and looks in it more often, because it is he and his colleagues from Scotland who have been playing the man and not the ball. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, what this debate is really about, and the debate around Brexit and Scottish independence, is really about what it means to be an independent nation in the modern world. And people will often ask why the Scottish National Party want to leave the United Kingdom but stay in the European Union. And the answer is very simple, and you don't have to look very far to see an example of what it is to be a partner in the European Union as opposed to what it is to be a member nation in the UK. Just look across the Irish Sea to Ireland and see the treatment that the Republic of Ireland has received from the European Union, where its economic and social considerations are put at the heart of the negotiations by the EU 27. Contrast that with the economic and social concerns of Scotland and indeed Northern Ireland, who voted to remain, but whose concerns are utterly sidelined, and in Scotland's case were given a total of 19 minutes for debating and accompanied by much sneering and condescension from the opposite benches when SNP MPs dared to protest. Now, what I would like to say to the benches opposite is that their sneering and their condescension is not a good look. And what I'd ask them to... No, I won't give way. I want to develop my point. What I'd ask them to reflect upon is the impression that their behaviour is likely to have on voters in Scotland when, as seems likely for the reasons admirably elaborated by my honourable friend, this current Tory government collapses under the weight of its own division and they're forced to go to the country again in another general election. Because I suggest to them that their role as lobby fodder and the way in which they have sneered and condescended when the SNP have attempted to protest about the lack of time given to devolution and the impact of Brexit and devolution in this chamber, I suggest to them that it will not serve them well. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the disparity between the treatment of the Republic of Ireland within the European Union and the treatment of Scotland within the United Kingdom illustrates very clearly why I and my colleagues wish to leave the Union of the UK but remain within the European Union. The European Union... No, I won't give way. I won't give way. I don't have long left and I'm not going to give way. The European Union is a union of equals. The United Kingdom is not a union of equals. The United Kingdom is not a union of equals because Scotland is not treated as an equal partner in this union. We want to be in a union where we're an equal partner. And if the honourable members opposite would just for a moment stop trying to shout me down, I want to finish by answering a point made by the Secretary of State for Scotland when he said that the Sewell Convention was a pillar of the devolution settlement. What I would suggest to him is that the insertion of the word normally put a pretty big crack in that pillar. And the thought I would like to leave him with is, if he was building a house to live in, would he build it on top of a pillar which only normally stood up?
Madam Speaker, for calling me to speak in this important debate. Today, Madam Speaker, I have been dealing with the death of a young constituent, Alicia McPhail, and I offer my condolences to the family and support to her family and friends in this dark time. I have been in a meeting with the Scottish Affairs Committee dealing with very important issues around immigration. I have been making representations to ministers on the future of our trading policy if and when we are able to negotiate a deal to leave the European Union. These are important issues that impact on the day-to-day goings-ons of the people of Coatbridge, Christon and Bellshill, across Scotland and indeed the United Kingdom. Far more important than the narrow obsession with the constitutional issues that seem to occupy the members of the SNP benches. I want to be brief today, Madam Speaker, and I start with the fact that I am very firmly of the view that the people of Scotland are sovereign. They have the ultimate say. They are our boss, and they are the people of Scotland who have the right to determine and form a government best suited to their needs. This is a principle that I believe in, and importantly, it is a fundamental principle that the Labour Party is very proud of. It was a Labour government that restored the power to the people of Scotland. It was a Labour government that allowed the people of Scotland to vote in the Scottish Parliament elections and elect a Scottish government. And in September 2014, that principle was honoured. The people of Scotland decided that our country was stronger together and the values and objectives of the Union were held together. My socialism has no borders. The motion before us asks us to endorse the principles of the claim of right, like it was endorsed in 1989. I do just wonder if any members of the SNP benches can remind us, when they speak, how many members of the SNP signed the claim of right in 1989. In fact, there were only two parties who didn't sign the claim of right: the actual Tories and the tartan Tories. And I say to the SNP, if they want to demonstrate their commitment to standing up for Scotland, they should have chosen another topic, because their record isn't strong in this issue. And the House will be interested to know that the claim of right was first signed in 1989 by all Labour MPs, with the exception of Tam Dalyell. The Tories didn't sign up to the Scottish Constitutional Convention or the claim of right because they were opposed to devolution. And the SNP didn't sign up to the Scottish Constitutional Convention or the claim of right because it didn't consider independence at the time. The people of Scotland are tired of constitutional debates. They want the government here and the government in Holyrood to work. A Labour Party led by a government in Scotland and a government in Westminster will do that. I welcome the opportunity to remind the House of my belief in the people of Scotland, my passion for representing and standing up for them, and that means focusing on jobs, welfare, Europe, and ensuring the people of Scotland don't pay the price for the Tories in Europe and the SNP in Scotland. Thank you.
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I find it rather interesting that in the course of almost a 3-hour debate we've not heard anyone speak up against the notion of the claim of right. But I would caution colleagues against being deluded by any faux agreement on this matter, because I am confident there are many members of this chamber, not here tonight present, who would find it presumptuous, indeed, they would find it very presumptuous that a group of citizens in one part of this island should assert the claim to be able to control their own destiny. And they would do that because they regard this as a single nation. And they regard the people of Scotland, whilst important, as having no other rights than the people of the West Midlands or East Anglia. I'm pleased, I think, to recognise that most contributors to the debate tonight realise that the basis of our constitution is different than that. And in fact, we may have a single polity, but we have a multinational country which is based on serial acts of union that bring its component parts together. Because once we understand that, then the claim of right itself has to be the intellectual corollary of that position, because a union can only be maintained by consent. And if the people of Scotland do not therefore give their consent to maintaining it, it will naturally fall. Now, this idea of popular sovereignty of the people of Scotland is quite an old-fashioned one. In 2 years' time, we celebrate the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath. And that is a document worth looking at. It was, in fact, a letter from the nobles of Scotland to the Pope at the time, asking for him to intervene, and much of the language is archaic and much of it is reverential. But yet in there is the grain of something that was never before expressed. It says clearly that if the King of Scotland does not represent the wishes of the people, then the people will find themselves a king who will.
Hear, hear.
It is the first expression in modern times of the notion of popular sovereignty.
Hear, hear.
Now, that idea has ebbed and flowed over the 7 centuries in between. 300 years ago, it inspired the dissenters who were resisting the fledgling union because they felt it was a matter of being sold out by the Scottish aristocracy. 200 years ago, it fuelled people like the friendly societies, people like Thomas Muir, who were working for popular democracy and universal franchise. 100 years ago, it motivated the Red Clydesiders and people like John Maclean. The idea of Scottish popular sovereignty has always been consistent throughout the centuries, but never more so than the present day, and never more so than 20 years ago, when the 1998 Scotland Act, for the first time in all of those centuries, actually asked the people what form of government they would like. And they said, by a massive majority, 3/4 of them voted to establish the Scottish Parliament. Now, the reason why we bring this debate here tonight about the claim of right for Scotland is because we believe that devolution settlement itself is very much under threat, and we wish to alert this chamber and this country to what is going on. The Secretary of State for Scotland says there is no power grab. In fact, there's a powers bonanza. The member for East Dunbartonshire, in a previous debate, listed a whole range of topics that would become the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament after Brexit. But we misunderstand if we think that responsibility is the same as power. Because what is happening at the same time as these areas of responsibility being transferred to the Scottish Parliament is that the Scottish Parliament's ability to do anything about them is being limited and constrained like never before. It is intended that in so many areas, not just the ones transferring from Brussels, but areas which are currently the exclusive competence of the Scottish Parliament, it is intended that in the future these will be subject to UK-wide frameworks. Now, we don't yet, and I see today's Fishing White Paper does not yet have an idea as to exactly how these frameworks might work. We have so far been talking about the principle, but it's the principle that's important. Picture a UK-wide committee to talk about fishing policy. The interests of Scottish fishermen will be represented by the Scottish Government, likewise Welsh and Northern Irish. But who will speak for the fishermen of England? Well, that will be DEFRA. That will be a committee and a department of Westminster who will do that. And at the same time, if there is a divergence of opinion or a difference of view, then it will be DEFRA who will determine what actually happens. And that means not a partnership. That means that the devolved administrations will be subject to and subservient to the will of the majority. And the Secretary of State may say that Scotland is part of the UK, but I tell him Scotland is not part of England. And effectively, that is what that arrangement would lead to.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, we talked about 2000. So, is there an intervention coming? We talked about
I would just like to take issue with the honourable gentleman's statement of Scotland not being part of England, when in fact Scotland has never been, or certainly in the life of this Parliament, never been part of England, and that is not what the Secretary of State said.
No. I think he might have prepared that better. And the point I was making is that, in effect, it will make Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, for that matter, subservient to the will of the government in this place. And that is contrary to the whole spirit of devolution. 20 years ago, when the architects of devolution, Donald Dewar in this House and John Sewell in the other, were framing the proposals, they understood the need to try and make sure that this was seen as a genuine commitment to the decentralisation of political power. Therefore, they enshrined a principle that said that if there are matters devolved to the Scottish Parliament, then this place will not interfere in those matters and will not determine anything about them without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. That principle has stood for 20 years and not been challenged across the House. And yet last week, Mr. Speaker, we made history. For the first time, a piece of legislation in the United Kingdom became law, which required the consent of the Scottish Parliament, which was not given. And that is a problem for everyone, and it will have to be addressed. Many members have questioned our motives in bringing this debate. I fear we're running out of time, so I won't take his intervention. Many members have talked about the referendum of 2014 and the idea, and my leader expressed this so well in his opening remarks. For those 15 hours on the 18th of September 2014, sovereignty was genuinely in the hands of the people of Scotland. Yeah. They had a choice to make between two alternate futures, and they chose one. Now, I don't agree with the choice that they made, but I fully respect it, and I respect it completely as a decision that they took. But I tell you this, in the same way that a dog isn't only for Christmas, sovereignty isn't only for the 18th of September 2014. Sovereignty means that you have the ability to change your mind if the circumstances around you change. You have the ability to adapt and take a new view. And the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland said, as my honourable member for Edinburgh South West has commented, she asked us to imagine a situation where a Scottish Parliament might be elected, where a majority of its members had stood on a manifesto suggesting that the people should be consulted in a referendum, and if that majority were then to vote in the Scottish Parliament and that to become the policy of the Parliament, it would be inappropriate for this Parliament to stand in its way. That was her suggestion, and I agree with it. The problem is that I say to her, this is not a matter of hypothesis for the future. This is real. 26 months ago, that is exactly what happened in the Scottish general election, and a mandate was sought for and a mandate was given. And as others have said, that mandate is extant. But it will be for the judgment of the Scottish Parliament to determine, when the dust settles on this Brexit mess that we are currently in, whether or not they believe it is in the best interest of the people of Scotland that they be consulted again on their constitutional future, and whether they wish to remain part of an isolationist United Kingdom, or whether they wish to be part of opening up to the world and playing their role as an independent country. And that day will come, and the claim of right for Scotland means that the people will have their right to exercise their decision on that matter when that time comes.
Thank you. Minister Stuart Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin actually by just talking about the honourable member for Coatbridge, Christon and Bellshill? He quite rightly mentioned the sad death of his constituent, Alicia MacPhail, and I think it's right that we all send our condolences to her family and to say that we're with the community in this very difficult time. Mr. Speaker, I'm beginning to realise that these debates become incredibly lively. The one in Westminster Hall last week was just as enjoyable, and I'm very pleased to be able to respond to this debate today. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, has said and suggested, this debate, frankly, has served Scotland no real purpose. As he said, we could have debated our preparations for leaving the EU, or for the economy, or how to address the many and varied failings of the Scottish Government. And I would add that we could have also debated the expansion of Heathrow Airport and the very many benefits that will bring to Scotland in terms of extra routes and greater opportunities for exporters. It is no surprise that we are not debating that issue, of course, because the SNP refused to support it. They refuse to support it not because it's good for Scotland, they actually agree that it is, but because they believe their stance would be good for the Scottish Nationalist Party. And that, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, is this debate in a nutshell. It's not about what is right for Scotland, it is about what serves the self-interest of the Scottish National Party. I'll happily give way.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way. Can the Minister name one route that was guaranteed by the UK Government to Heathrow in the National Planning Statement?
Well, as you will know, there are 15% routes that are guaranteed for regional connectivity. And the fact is that he's turned down the opportunity for his own country to have better connectivity to the rest of this country and to the rest of the world. He talks about wanting to stand up for Scotland. He should take part in the debates that happen here and vote in them, rather than walking out as he did at Prime Minister's questions. Now, Mr. Speaker, the claim of right was about devolution, and we support devolution. This government has consistently supported devolution ever since it was backed by the people of Scotland in a referendum in 1997. And it was the Scottish people who reaffirmed their support for devolution in the independence referendum of 2014. We have shown our support with the Scotland Act of 2016, which transferred wide-ranging powers over tax, welfare and much more to Holyrood, and we continue to show our support for devolution as we prepare to leave the EU. Scores of powers previously held in Brussels will flow to the Scottish Parliament, and we are working with the Scottish Government to ensure Scotland and the whole of the UK are ready. In doing so, we are listening to the people of Scotland. We are respecting the votes that they cast in 1997 and in 2014. We are respecting their rights as expressed by the authors of the Claim of Right. The truth is, though, that the SNP cannot bring themselves to show the same respect. They refused to sign the Claim of Right because it had nothing to do with their cause of independence. They saw devolution only as a stepping stone to independence, and they have shown themselves to be equally opportunistic when it comes to breakfast. And breakfast. Yes, breakfast, dinner and tea, as we say in the North. Shamefully, they have no interest in preparing Scotland and the UK for leaving the EU. They see it only as a chance to scaremonger and manufacture grievances in a bid to support and boost their cause for independence. That is their purpose in today's debate, but people will see it for what it is. They will see through the SNP's games, and they will understand that they are not acting in Scotland's interests, but in their own narrow party interests. Now, I want to respond. No, the honourable gentleman had far too long to speak at the beginning. And in fact, I'll come on to the point that he said right at the very beginning. He let the cat out of the bag in the very first sentences of his contribution, when he was almost lost his temper, and he clearly let the cat out of the bag that all this is about is pushing for another referendum for Scottish independence. He said that there was a majority for independence in the Scottish Parliament, but the point is there was a majority of the people of Scotland who voted no in the independence referendum. He also said that we ripped up the Sewell Convention. I really do not understand how he can say that. It does seem that the Scottish Government and some honourable and right honourable members, when taking part in this debate, appear to have read "not normally," that is written in the Convention, to mean not at all. Never, in no circumstance whatsoever. Some members of this House may wish to change the terms of the Convention, but this is the Convention that we have. He also talked about this government wanting to attack the poor. I have to say to him, I find that really quite a disgraceful comment. We have done an enormous amount to turn the economy round, and trying to get, he can continue to heckle. I'll come on to some of the behaviour that he had in this debate. We have done an enormous amount to turn this economy round. We've got record employment. We have lowered taxes. We've taken the poorest out of tax altogether. And our national living wage has given people in this country, the poorest, the biggest increase in their wage for a long time. He also said that we are all about a power grab, and that the Secretary of State couldn't name a single power that would be going to the Scottish Parliament. I really don't understand that. In a previous debate, my honourable friend for East Renfrewshire spent about half of his speech listing all of the powers that will be going to Holyrood, and he could not. In fact, he couldn't continue on the time limits he had to list them all. I'll happily give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, because will he also accept that in a debate last week, not a single SNP MP could tell us any powers the Scottish Parliament were losing, and today, every time I tried to intervene on the right honourable gentleman about power grab, he wouldn't accept it, because they know Scotland is getting a huge number of powers from this Westminster government as a result of Brexit.
Quite right.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and this is part of the process that the SNP are trying to use. They're trying to create an image that the government are trying to take powers away from Scotland, when the fact is that when those powers come from Brussels, when we leave the EU, we will be transferring those powers to the Scottish Parliament. That is why Nicola Sturgeon herself has had to increase the size of her cabinet, because they have more responsibility. Not my words, they were her words in answer to why we were increasing.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker, can I just clarify what has been going on here? Because what is happening through the Withdrawal Bill, that powers which are reserved under the Scotland Act are being taken back by Westminster. That's the reality, and that's the fact. There are no powers that are being gifted by Westminster, and the Minister is simply wrong.
Unfortunately, it suffers from the grave disadvantage of not even approximating to or imitating a point of order. As the cheeky grin on the right honourable gentleman's face testifies, he knows he was declined when he sought to intervene, and therefore he opted for the somewhat cheeky ruse of a bogus point of order. But he has made his point. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And also, I want to challenge the assertion that's been made by various members of the Scottish Nationalists that my honourable friends who are representing Scottish seats should stand up for their constituents. Well, I have the privilege of working with them on a regular basis, and I can tell you that is what they do day in, day out with great force, regularly meeting ministers from all sorts of departments in this government to fight for the corner not just of their constituents but for the whole of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, I also refer to other points that were made. My honourable friend from Murray obviously talked about the tone of this debate. I have to say I was surprised at the way interventions were rejected by the leader of the SNP. There are ways that we behave ourselves in this House. He talked about important issues about education and health.
Point of order, Joanna Cherry. I hope it is a point of order, not a point of frustration.
Repeatedly this evening, members opposite have sought to suggest that my right honourable friend, the member for Roskillie and Lochaber, has done something disorderly. Can the Speaker confirm for the record that he has done nothing disorderly and has not been ruled disorderly this evening? It's character assassination, Mr. Speaker.
Right honourable gentleman to be disorderly. I think I said to him at one point it was perhaps a bit off to say sit down to the Minister. But in terms of the general conduct of the right honourable gentleman, it has been abrasive, but it has not been disorderly. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't say that the right honourable gentleman was disorderly. I just simply said that the tone and the behaviour I didn't think was appropriate for this debate.
Very well, point of order. To be put. The question is the question be now put. This is effectively the closure. As many as other opinions say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is the motion as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I'm genuinely sorry that the honourable gentleman member for Pudsey was not able to conclude his speech, and I say that simply because he is the very embodiment of courtesy in the House. But I'm afraid that's sometimes the way the cookie crumbles. No personal discourtesy is intended to the honourable gentleman. Motion number 6 on local government. The whip to move. Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Petition Nick Dakin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.